In every corner of the world, there are objects that whisper stories from thousands of years ago. Some were held by kings, some shaped by unknown hands, and some left behind with no explanation at all. Tonight, we will journey through these treasures one by one, feeling the weight of their history, the mystery of their purpose, and the quiet presence they still hold in our world. If you enjoy wandering through time with me, consider subscribing so we can keep exploring the past together, even as you drift peacefully into sleep. Bird-shaped pestle. In the quiet green highlands of Papua New Guinea, far from the noise of cities and the rhythm of modern life, archaeologists uncovered an object that seemed at first glance almost too delicate to be a tool. It was carved from hard stone, shaped with smooth curves, and polished until its surface caught the light in a way that felt almost alive. What made it unusual wasn't just the craftsmanship, it was its form. This was no ordinary pestle for grinding food. Its shape was unmistakable. The body of a bird, its beak stretched forward, its wings suggested in the gentle slope of the stone. A tool, yes, but also a sculpture, a symbol, and perhaps a silent messenger from a time long before history was written. The bird-shaped pestle is believed to be over 3,000 years old, dating back to the early agricultural communities of the region. Papua New Guinea is one of the few places in the world where agriculture developed independently, without influence from outside civilizations. While much of the world's early farming sprang from the Fertile Crescent or from river valleys like those of the Nile or the Yangtze, here, in the mountainous jungles, people were also learning to cultivate the land, growing taro, yams, bananas, and sugarcane. They created their own traditions, their own tools, and their own ways of connecting daily work with meaning. This pestle is part of that story. When you hold an object like this, though most of us never will, you can imagine the hands that shaped it, not in a workshop with metal chisels and fine files, but perhaps sitting by a riverbank with another piece of hard stone, patiently pecking, grinding, and smoothing over days or even weeks. The shape of the bird might have been inspired by the environment, the calls of parrots in the forest canopy, the sight of a hornbill gliding between treetops, or the swift dart of a kingfisher along a mountain stream. For the maker, perhaps this bird was a symbol of abundance, guidance, or good fortune. In a practical sense, the pestle was used for grinding food, taro roots into paste, nuts into meal, or seeds into powder. But in a deeper sense, this carving may have represented more than just utility. Across many ancient cultures, the tools that people used every day often carried designs that spoke to their beliefs. A decorated pestle might have been owned by a skilled farmer or a respected elder. It could have been brought out for ceremonial feasts, where the grinding of food was part of a ritual that connected people to the earth, to their ancestors, and to the spirits they believed governed the world around them. One of the most fascinating aspects of this artifact is how it bridges two worlds, the practical and the symbolic. In modern times, we often separate the two. We think of tools as purely functional and art as decorative or expressive. But for ancient peoples, the two were often inseparable. A pestle could be a tool, a work of art, and a sacred object all at once. In this way, the bird-shaped pestle is like a key, unlocking a way of thinking that is different from our own, where the line between work and worship was thin, and the beauty of an object was part of its power. Archaeologists found the pestle buried in soil that had not been disturbed for centuries. It lay in the dark, protected from the tropical rains, waiting for the moment it would be uncovered again. The surrounding area held traces of early farming, stone tools, grinding stones, and plant remains. Together, these finds tell a story of a community that thrived in the highlands long before written records. We don't know the name of the person who carved the bird, or even the language they spoke, but the object speaks in its own quiet way, through the universal language of form and craftsmanship. Its smooth curves suggest that it was held many times, perhaps by generations of hands. The beak of the bird shows slight wear, as if it had been tapped against the edge of a mortar again and again. These marks of use make it more real. This was not an ornament to be displayed, but a working object, part of daily life. And yet the care taken in its carving shows that its maker valued more than just efficiency. They valued beauty, identity, and meaning. There's also a mystery here. Why a bird? Was this a common design, or was it special to one community? Some researchers think that birds may have been linked to agricultural cycles, migration patterns, or weather changes. Others believe the bird might have been a totem, representing a clan or family group. In many Pacific cultures, animals are seen as spiritual guides, and certain birds are believed to carry messages between the living and the spirit world. If that was the case here, the pestle might not have been just for preparing food. It could have been a tool for preparing offerings to those spirits, a bridge between the human and the divine. Over the centuries, the society that made the bird-shaped pestle changed. New tools appeared, new crops were introduced, and ways of life shifted, but the pestle survived, protected by the earth, until it was rediscovered. Today it sits in a museum, far from the highland forests where it was made, displayed behind glass. People walk past it, some pausing to read the small label, others just glancing at its unusual shape before moving on. But for those who stop and really look, it holds a deeper kind of fascination. It is a reminder that human creativity, patience, and a sense of beauty have been with us for as long as we've shaped tools from stone. The bird-shaped pestle speaks quietly, without words, but its message is clear. It tells us that even in the earliest farming communities, people didn't just work to survive, they worked to create. They left behind objects that could be used, admired, and passed down, and in doing so, they left a piece of themselves for the future. In its curves, its polished surface, and its enduring form, we can still feel the presence of its maker, and through it, connect to a world that vanished thousands of years ago. The Australian Bark Shield. 1725. In 1775. In a quiet corner of the British Museum, behind protective glass, rests an object that at first glance might seem simple, humble even. It is long and narrow, slightly curved, its surface marked with the faint traces of age. To the untrained eye, it could be mistaken for nothing more than a large piece of worn wood. But this is no ordinary plank. It is the Australian Bark Shield, dated between 1725 and 1775, a relic of a world that existed long before colonial ships reached the shores of what we now call Australia. This shield is not carved from hardwood, it is not forged from metal. Instead, it is shaped from the living bark of a tree, cut carefully in a single sheet, then heated, shaped, and reinforced using techniques passed down through generations of Aboriginal craftsmen. At the time it was made, this object was not merely a tool of defense, it was a lifeline, a symbol, and a record of cultural knowledge that had been refined over countless centuries. When you stand before it, your eyes are drawn to the long vertical slit running down its center. This opening, though seemingly decorative, served a very functional purpose. It allowed the warrior's hand to grip the inner handle while the rest of the arm remained shielded. The edges of the bark, though now brittle with age, would once have been tough and flexible, capable of absorbing and deflecting blows from spears, boomerangs, and wooden clubs. Its reddish-brown surface carries faint traces of pigment, painted patterns that may once have been bright and striking. Some experts believe these markings were not merely for decoration, but could have carried deep cultural meaning, perhaps clan symbols, personal emblems, or designs tied to the dreaming stories, the spiritual framework that connects Aboriginal people to their ancestors, their land, and the cosmos. These patterns may have told of the warrior's identity, his role in the community, or even his personal achievements, but perhaps the most intriguing detail about this shield is the mystery surrounding its journey. How did it come to rest in a London museum so far from the land and people that gave it life? Some historians believe it may have been collected during one of the earliest European expeditions along the Australian coast, possibly during the voyages of Captain Cook in the 18th century. Cook's landing at Botany Bay in 1770 is recorded in detail, and among those records is an account of an encounter with Aboriginal people in which a bark shield was left behind after a confrontation. Some scholars have suggested that the very shield we see today could be that same artifact, a silent witness to the first violent clash between Europeans and Australia's First Nations people. If this theory is correct, then the shield is not only a piece of weaponry, it is a living fragment of one of the most pivotal moments in Australian history. It would mean that this object was present at the very first meeting of two worlds, each utterly alien to the other. The Aboriginal warrior who once held it may have faced strangers whose skin, clothing, and technology seemed unlike anything he had ever known. Likewise, the Europeans, stepping onto a continent they had never seen before, may have viewed this shield with equal measures of curiosity and misunderstanding. But there is more to the story than first contact. Aboriginal bark shields were not mass-produced. They were shaped by hand, using skills that required intimate knowledge of the land. The maker would need to know exactly which tree to choose, when to harvest the bark, and how to prepare it without splitting or cracking. The fact that this shield has survived for nearly 300 years, despite being made from organic material, is a testament to that craftsmanship. In many Aboriginal cultures, shields were more than just tools for battle. They could be symbols of manhood, given to a young warrior at a significant point in his life. They might be carried not only in combat, but also in ceremonial dances, where they were painted and displayed as signs of strength, protection, and heritage. To hold such a shield was to carry a piece of one's ancestors into the present moment. Standing in front of it now, you can almost imagine the sound of dry earth beneath bare feet, the sharp calls of birds circling overhead, and the distant shimmer of heat across the land. You can picture the man who once carried it, his eyes alert, his body poised, his mind filled with the knowledge passed down through his elders. This shield was part of him, and in some ways it still is. Today, in its glass case, It no longer needs to block a spear or turn away a boomerang. But it still defends something: memory. It holds back the tide of forgetting. For every person who pauses to study it, the shield becomes a bridge across time, connecting the present to the deep and complex history of Australia's First Nations peoples. And that is the real mystery, not just how it was made, or who carried it, but how something so fragile has endured for centuries, and what stories it still carries that no one alive today can fully read. The Australian bark shield is more than bark. It is the silence between two worlds, preserved in wood. The North American buckskin map. In the quiet, dimly lit archives of a museum, there lies an object that does not gleam with gold or sparkle with gemstones. Yet it carries a weight of history that no treasure chest could match. Stretched across a frame, tanned and preserved for centuries, is a piece of buckskin, the soft, durable leather once made from deer hide. At first glance it may look simple. Its surface is uneven, its tones earthy and muted, but closer inspection reveals something extraordinary. Delicate, carefully drawn markings in black, red, and yellow pigments. A map, a guide, a record of knowledge that belonged to a people whose history was passed not in books but in memory, in the lines of a song, in the careful brush of a hand on tanned hide. This is the North American buckskin map, an artifact that captures a moment in time when two worlds were meeting. It is believed to have been created by Native American hands sometime in the 18th century, during the early waves of European exploration and settlement. To the indigenous people who made it, it was not just a chart of rivers, villages, and trails. It was a living document, a record of relationships between people, land, and water. Unlike the rigid, gridded maps drawn by European cartographers, this map flows like the land itself. Rivers curve gently, branching like veins across the surface. Villages are marked by small, symbolic designs rather than standardized icons. There are no compass roses or neat borders. Instead, the orientation follows the journey itself, the way a traveler would walk the land, not the way an outsider might try to measure it. This difference in style tells us something powerful, that for its creators, a map was not about control or ownership. It was about memory, movement, and connection. Scholars believe the map may have been created to guide European traders, or perhaps to record an agreement between indigenous communities and new arrivals. Some of its symbols seem to show trading posts. Others might represent tribal territories or meeting places. The pigments used, likely made from natural sources such as charcoal, ochre, and clay, were chosen not just for their availability, but for their endurance. Even after centuries, they remain visible, their colors faint yet alive. The buckskin itself carries its own story. Deer hide was prepared through a process known as brain tanning, in which the natural oils from the animal were used to soften and preserve the skin. This made it resistant to decay, able to survive the harsh conditions of travel and weather. A map like this could be rolled up, carried in a pouch, and unrolled whenever the path ahead was uncertain. Holding it now, one can imagine the hands that made it, the slow, deliberate strokes, the memory of each river bend and hilltop, the knowledge passed down from elders. And one can also imagine the exchanges that followed. Indigenous leaders pointing to places on the map, explaining their meaning to a foreign visitor who perhaps did not fully understand the depth of what he was being shown. Today, the buckskin map is more than just a relic. It is a reminder of a time when knowledge was not written in books, but lived in the land. It tells us that the history of North America is not simply a story of European arrival. It is a story of cultures meeting, trading, clashing, and sometimes finding ways to share. And while the map itself is silent, the paths it shows still exist, etched into the rivers, forests, and plains of the continent. When you look at it under museum lights, it is easy to forget that this artifact was once carried across open country, unrolled under the sun, and used to find a way forward. It is easy to forget that this buckskin once came from a living creature, that the pigments were ground by human hands, that the shapes were drawn from lived experience. Yet the quiet truth is there in the faint lines, in the worn edges, in the way this simple piece of leather has outlived the people who made it, and perhaps even the languages they spoke. In the end, the North American buckskin map is not just an ancient guide to the land, it is a guide to understanding. A reminder that maps are more than directions. They are the memory of a people, carried forward through time, whispering stories to anyone willing to listen. Hawaiian feather helmet. In the warm winds of the Pacific, where the waves roll endlessly toward volcanic shores and the air carries the scent of salt and blossoms, there exists an artifact unlike any other, the Hawaiian feather helmet. Known as the mahioli, it was more than a piece of armor. It was a declaration of status, a signal of power, and a living canvas for the traditions of the Hawaiian chiefs. When you first see one, it feels almost unreal, its curved shape rising high like a crest, is covered in brilliant feathers, red, yellow, sometimes black, woven tightly together in patterns that catch the light. These colors were not chosen by accident. In Hawaiian tradition, red and yellow were symbols of royalty, mana, the spiritual power that chiefs were believed to carry. Every feather was precious, and every pattern spoke of rank, genealogy, and divine right. Imagine the process of creating it. This was not a matter of a few days' work. Feathers were gathered from rare forest birds, the oo and the mamo, now extinct, and the iwiwi, still found fluttering among the blossoms. Gathering these feathers was a sacred task. Birds were caught carefully, plucked for only a few feathers, and then released, a sign of respect for life and the balance of nature. It might take years, even decades, to collect enough to cover a single helmet, and all the while, these feathers were guarded, stored, and kept from harm, because their colors were more than decoration. They were the physical embodiment of the chief's mana. The base of the helmet was woven from strong fibers, often from the iwi vine, then shaped to fit the head closely, with an open face and a high crest. It had to be strong enough to withstand battle, but light enough to wear for long ceremonies. And battle was very much a reality for the chiefs who wore these. Hawaii, in the 18th century, was not a single unified kingdom. It was a collection of islands, each with its own rulers, each vying for power, territory, and tribute. The mahioli was both a practical form of protection and a psychological weapon. Seeing a chief ride into battle with a gleaming feathered crest was meant to inspire his warriors and intimidate his enemies, but the helmet's significance extended far beyond war. It was worn during important ceremonies, the makahiki festivals, religious rites, and meetings between chiefs. In those moments it became part of a living story, one where genealogy, politics, and spiritual beliefs merged into a single symbol. When Western explorers first arrived in Hawaii in the late 18th century, they were stunned by the craftsmanship of these helmets. Captain James Cook's crew recorded seeing them during their visits, describing their vibrant colors and unusual shapes. Many were traded or gifted to European visitors, though sometimes gifted under pressure, as power shifted with the arrival of new weapons and diseases. Over time, many of these helmets made their way into museums across the world. Today, the Hawaiian feather helmet is as likely to be found in a glass case in London or New York as it is in Hawaii. Yet for the Hawaiian people, the mahioli is still a potent reminder of their heritage. It speaks of a time when color itself was sacred, when a chief's authority was not only declared through laws or armies, but through the careful arrangement of a few thousand feathers, each one carrying a story. If you imagine holding one, you might feel the smooth curve beneath your hands, the dense weave of the fibers, and the softness of feathers that have somehow survived for centuries. You might imagine the light catching the red so that it almost glows, or the deep yellow shimmering like sunlight on calm water. And you might think of the generations who looked upon that same helmet and saw not just an object, but the living presence of a leader. In a way, the mahiola is not just a relic, it's a quiet echo of the Hawaiian worldview, one where the land, the sea, the birds, and the people were all bound together. To wear it was to carry the authority of that world on your head, to be recognized as a bridge between the spiritual and the earthly, between the past and the present. Today, whenever one is brought back to Hawaii, it is welcomed almost like a person returning home. Ceremonies are held, chants are performed, and the helmet is honored before it takes its place in a collection or exhibition, because to the descendants of those chiefs, it is not just an artifact, it is a living ancestor, a guardian of memory, and a witness to centuries of change. And so, in the quiet halls of a museum, or in the protective shadows of a Hawaiian cultural center, the feather helmet waits. It no longer rides into battle, no longer glitters under the sun of a festival day, but it still carries the mana of those who once wore it. And if you stand before it long enough, you might almost hear the faint rustle of feathers in the island breeze, a whisper from a time when colors were power, and a helmet could speak louder than any words. Miniature of a Mughal prince. The Mughal Empire was one of the most opulent, artistically rich, and politically sophisticated dynasties the world has ever seen. At its height, it stretched across much of the Indian subcontinent, weaving together cultures, religions, and traditions into a tapestry of breathtaking complexity. Among its treasures were not only monumental structures like the Taj Mahal and the Red Fort, but also objects so small, so delicate, that they could be cradled in the palm of your hand, yet carried within them the weight of centuries of history. One such object is the miniature painting of a Mughal prince. When we think of royal portraiture, we often imagine large canvases or marble busts towering over rooms, but in the Mughal tradition, beauty was often distilled into work so fine that a single eyelash in the painting might have been rendered with the tip of a brush made from one squirrel hair. Miniatures were not merely decorative, they were windows into the soul of an empire, coated with symbolism, political messaging, and artistry that has endured for hundreds of years. This particular painting, showing a Mughal prince, is a masterclass in detail. The figure is dressed in flowing robes that shimmer with subtle golden tones. His turban is adorned with a delicate jewel, a peacock feather curling slightly at its edge, catching the light in a way that speaks of both raganili and elegance. In his hand he might hold a small flower, perhaps a rose, symbolizing refinement and beauty, or a jeweled sword representing power and authority. Every fold of fabric, every shadow on his face, is a deliberate choice made by the artist to tell a story about who this prince was and what he represented. The tradition of miniature painting in the Mughal court was heavily influenced by Persian techniques, but over time it absorbed Indian aesthetics and naturalistic detail. Artists were commissioned by emperors and high-ranking nobles, working in ateliers where pigments were ground from precious stones like lapis lazuli and malachite. Even gold and silver leaf were used to bring a painting to life, making it not only a visual experience but also a tactile and luminous one. This miniature, like many others of its time, was not just an isolated work of art, it was part of an album, called a muraka, where pages of calligraphy, poetry, and paintings were bound together. These albums served as a kind of private treasure chest for the elite, brought out on special occasions or to impress a guest of honor. To hold one of these albums was to hold the very essence of Mughal sophistication in your hands. The prince in this image may not have been identified by name, yet every element in the composition hints at his status. The background could be a serene garden, suggesting leisure and refinement, or perhaps a patterned textile that frames him in an aura of grandeur. His posture is straight yet relaxed, his expression calm yet commanding. The artist likely took months, maybe even years, to achieve this perfect balance of power and poise. Miniatures were also political tools. In an era before photography, these paintings could be exchanged between courts as diplomatic gifts or carried on journeys to introduce a prince to potential allies or spouses. In this way, the miniature became both a work of art and a messenger, bridging distances and building relationships across empires. But beyond politics and power, there is something deeply human about these images. They show us how the Mughals saw themselves, not just as rulers, but as patrons of beauty, as guardians of culture, as men and women who valued poetry, gardens and music as much as they valued armies and fortresses. A single brushstroke on the prince's cheek might capture a softness rarely shown in grand architecture or military chronicles. Today, the miniature of this Mughal prince survives as a testament to an age when art was as important as strategy, when rulers measured their greatness not only in the size of their armies, but in the beauty of their courts. To see it up close is to feel, for a moment, that you are sitting in a candlelit Mughal palace, the scent of rosewater drifting through the air, a poet reciting verses nearby, while the prince himself sits for the artist, perhaps glancing out of the corner of his eye to see how his likeness is progressing. Objects like this remind us that history is not only written in stone and steel, but also in fragile pigments and paper. And yet, against all odds, these small works survive, whispering to us across centuries, inviting us to lean closer and listen. Religious Parade Standard. In a quiet museum hall, under soft, diffused light, stands a tall, intricately crafted object, its metal catching the glow in subtle ways. At first glance, it might seem like a ceremonial weapon, perhaps a lance or spear, but a closer look reveals that it was never meant for battle. This is a religious parade standard, an artifact that carries centuries of meaning, memory, and identity. The Shira standard, sometimes called an alam, was not merely a piece of metal carried through the streets. It was a symbol, a deeply emotional emblem, raised high during processions that marked important religious events. The most prominent of these occasions was the annual commemoration of Ashura, a day of mourning for the martyrdom of Imam Hussein, the grandson of the Prophet Muhammad, in the Battle of Karbala in 680 CE. This standard, with its complex metalwork, would have been held aloft as mourners moved through narrow streets, chanting prayers and laments. Its height and intricate design meant it could be seen from a great distance, guiding the eyes and hearts of the faithful toward the center of the procession. For many in the crowd, seeing it was like seeing a piece of living history, a reminder of sacrifice, justice, and the enduring struggle against oppression. The craftsmanship itself tells a story. The metal surface might be engraved with calligraphy, verses from the Quran, or depictions of symbolic animals and motifs, each detail chosen to reflect spiritual concepts. Some standards were decorated with the names of revered figures, while others incorporated imagery of hands, a reference to the open hand of Abbas ibn Ali, symbolizing generosity, defense of the faith, and loyalty to family. But to fully understand this object, we must place it in its proper setting, not in a quiet museum, but in the crowded, emotionally charged atmosphere of a traditional Shia mourning procession. Imagine the streets lined with people, the air thick with incense, the steady beating of drums echoing between the walls of old buildings. The standard sways slightly in the air, as its bearer walks slowly, often barefoot, as a sign of humility. Mourners follow, reciting poetry that has been passed down for centuries. During these processions, the standard was more than a marker of the event, it was an anchor of collective memory. In times when oral history was the primary way of passing down stories, such symbols helped communities remember not just what happened in Karbala, but why it mattered. The act of carrying the standard was often given to a trusted and respected member of the community, as it was considered both a privilege and a sacred duty. It's worth noting that these objects were not uniform. Each region, each era, brought its own style and influence. In some parts of the Islamic world, standards were more elaborate, with multiple tiers and complex ornamentation, while in others, they were simple and unadorned, focusing on the power of the symbol itself rather than decoration. This particular example, now preserved in a museum, shows a balance between beauty and symbolism, crafted not only to be seen, but to be felt. The metal, likely brass or steel, bears marks of age. Tiny scratches, worn edges, and the patina that comes only from decades of use remind us that this is not a static object. It has been in motion, carried through streets, raised high under the sun, exposed to wind and rain. Every mark is part of its story. For historians, such an artifact is invaluable. It connects material culture with religious practice, political history, and community identity. For the communities that created and carried it, it remains an enduring representation of loyalty to a cause greater than oneself. The Shia religious parade standard invites us to consider the role of symbols in human life. Why do we rally around certain objects? Why do we preserve them, sometimes at great effort, for generations? The answer lies in their ability to carry meaning far beyond their physical form. This standard is metal and craftsmanship, yes, but it is also grief, remembrance, and a declaration of unity. Even today, in Shia processions around the world, standards like this one still appear, often taller and more elaborate than ever. They bridge past and present, linking the mourners of centuries ago to those walking in the streets now. And though this particular standard now rests behind glass, far from the streets where it once moved, it still carries that same weight, the power to evoke memory and identity in those who stand before it. As we leave it behind in the museum, we understand that we have not just looked at an artifact, we have stood in the presence of a living tradition, frozen in time but still resonating with the echoes of 1,000 voices chanting in unison. The double-headed serpent, turquoise mosaic. In the quiet, controlled air of a museum, under soft lights that make every color come alive, there rests an object unlike anything else in the world, a double-headed serpent, its entire surface shimmering with thousands of tiny turquoise tiles. The first time you see it, you might feel a strange mix of awe and unease. The two snakeheads, carved in wood and covered with brilliant mosaics, seem to watch you from both ends, as if no matter which way you turn, one of them will meet your gaze. It is beautiful, yes, but there is something undeniably powerful in its presence. This artifact comes from the ancient Aztec world, a civilization that flourished in central Mexico before the Spanish conquest in the early 16th century. The serpent in Aztec culture was no ordinary creature. It was a sacred symbol, often representing fertility, renewal, and the life force itself. But when it has two heads, the meaning becomes far more complex. Scholars believe this could represent duality, life and death, earth and sky, creation and destruction. In the Aztec worldview, these opposites were not enemies but parts of a single cycle, always flowing into one another. The mosaic itself is a masterpiece of craftsmanship. The turquoise pieces were carefully shaped and fitted, their surfaces polished to a glass-like smoothness. Between them, tiny bits of red shell and black resin create contrast, giving the serpent's scales a depth and texture that feels almost alive. Each tile would have been painstakingly attached with natural adhesives, a process that must have taken days or even weeks to complete. This was not an object made for casual use. It was likely a ceremonial piece, worn or carried during important rituals. The fact that it has two heads might also hint at its role in bridging worlds. In Mesoamerican beliefs, serpents were often seen as creatures capable of moving between realms, the human world, the underworld, and the celestial sphere. A double-headed serpent might have been a powerful emblem of connection, linking two different planes of existence. Some researchers suggest it could have been worn by priests, perhaps draped across the shoulders like a mantle, signifying their authority to speak for both the living and the dead. The turquoise itself is another layer of mystery. This stone was not native to the Valley of Mexico. It had to be imported from faraway lands, possibly from what is now the southwestern United States. This means that by the time the serpent was created, the Aztecs were part of a vast trade network stretching hundreds of miles, exchanging goods, ideas, and symbols across cultures. For the turquoise to arrive in such abundance and quality, countless hands would have been involved, miners, traders, artisans, each playing their role in a chain of events that would end with this dazzling object. When the Spanish arrived in the early 1500s, many artifacts like this were destroyed, melted down, or carried away as spoils of conquest. That the double-headed serpent survives at all is remarkable. It eventually found its way into European collections, where for centuries it was treated as a curiosity rather than a sacred item. Today, museums take a different approach, working to preserve its cultural meaning and present it with respect to the descendants of those who created it. Looking closely at it now, one might notice the slight irregularities in the tiles, proof that this was made by human hands, not machines. The turquoise has aged, darkened in some spots, chipped in others, but its presence is still commanding. If you stand before it long enough, you might get the feeling that it's not just a piece of art. It's a relic of a worldview that saw the world as a living, breathing balance of forces. A reminder that in the grand cycles of existence, beginnings and endings are always intertwined. For the Aztecs, this serpent could have been a bridge, a guide, or a guardian. For us today, it's a survivor from a world that no longer exists, carrying with it whispers of ceremonies, chants, and beliefs that time has tried but failed to erase. And as you walk away, you may find that those twin heads still linger in your mind, each facing opposite directions, as if watching both the past and the future at the same time. Brass plaque, Oba with Europeans. In the warm, humid air of West Africa, centuries ago, a kingdom thrived along the trade routes of the Gulf of Guinea. It was the Kingdom of Benin, a highly organized and powerful state that existed long before colonial expansion reached its shores. Its palaces were not simple wooden halls but grand compounds of carved ivory, woven fabrics, and walls adorned with shining brass and bronze reliefs. Among these treasures was one particularly striking object, a brass plaque depicting the Oba, the king surrounded by European figures. At first glance, it might seem like just another piece of royal decoration, but this plaque is far more than that. It is a fragment of a complex history, a meeting point between two worlds that were never meant to blend so seamlessly. The plaque shows a ruler adorned in ceremonial regalia, his face composed and commanding, standing in the center. Around him are Europeans, their clothing unmistakably foreign, their weapons and hats unlike anything seen in West Africa before the 15th century. The details are sharp, the folds in the garments, the intricate beadwork of the king's coral regalia, the precise rendering of firearms that were still rare in this part of the world. This artwork was not a simple portrait. It was a record, one of hundreds created by the master artisans of Benin City. These plaques lined the wooden pillars of the royal palace, telling stories in metal, victories in battle, moments of diplomacy, scenes of daily life, and the presence of foreign traders. They were historical archives, political statements, and sacred symbols all at once. The Europeans on the plaque are most likely Portuguese traders, who arrived on the coast of Benin in the late 15th century. At the time, the Portuguese were exploring new maritime routes, driven by the search for gold, ivory, and spices. But when they reached the rich and well-governed Benin Kingdom, they found not a land to conquer, but a partner in trade. Benin's rulers controlled a network of markets and could supply valuable goods, especially pepper, ivory, and tragically, human captives for the Atlantic slave trade. The plaque captures this early stage of contact, when the relationship between the two powers was one of mutual interest. What is most fascinating about this plaque is the way it reverses the perspective we often see in history. European sources usually portray Africa as a passive participant in trade, but here the Oba stands at the center, his figure dominating the composition. The Europeans are smaller, positioned to the sides, their presence important but secondary. This was Benin's narrative, a visual assertion of power and sovereignty. The creation of such a plaque was no easy task. Benin's brass casters were part of a hereditary guild, their skills passed down through generations. The technique they used, known as the lost wax casting method, allowed them to create incredibly detailed reliefs. First, the design would be sculpted in wax, then encased in clay. Once the mold was heated, the wax melted away, leaving a cavity into which molten brass could be poured. When the mold cooled and was broken open, the final plaque emerged, ready to be polished and installed in the palace. Each one was unique, yet they formed a continuous narrative when displayed together. The plaque we know today survived against all odds. In 1897, during the British punitive expedition against Benin, the royal palace was looted and burned. Thousands of brass and bronze works were seized and transported to Europe. These artifacts, now known as the Benin bronzes, were scattered across museums and private collections worldwide. The brass plaque of the Oba with Europeans was among them, ending up in the British Museum, far from the city where it had been made. To see it now, mounted on a quiet gallery wall, is to experience a strange dislocation. It was once part of a living royal court, surrounded by the sounds of drums, the smell of palm oil fires, and the movement of people in ceremonial dress. Now it rests under sterile lighting, labeled in neat lettering, with its history reduced to a few lines on a placard. Yet if you stand before it long enough, it still speaks. The eyes of the Oba seem to meet yours directly. The Europeans at his side seem to glance away, as if aware that they were entering a world far older than their own empires. Archaeologists and historians have debated the meaning of this particular plaque for decades. Was it meant to commemorate a specific meeting between the Oba and Portuguese envoys? Was it a symbolic representation of the kingdom's role in international trade? Or was it a political statement, reminding court visitors that the king was powerful enough to command the respect of foreign powers? We may never know the precise moment it depicts, but we can understand the broader message. Benin saw itself as the center of its own world, a world where Europeans were just another set of visitors. The artistry of the plaque also carries hidden layers of meaning. The Oba's coral regalia, for example, was not just decorative, it was sacred. Coral beads were believed to have spiritual power, connecting the king to the divine realm. The weapons carried by the Europeans may have been intended to show both the benefits and dangers of contact with foreign traders. Even the arrangement of figures speaks volumes. The central, larger figure of the Oba reflects his dominance over the smaller, peripheral visitors. When we think about ancient artifacts, it's tempting to see them as static objects, but this plaque is not static. It is part of a continuing story. Its journey from the Benin Palace to a London museum mirrors the broader history of colonialism, cultural displacement, and the ongoing fight for the return of stolen heritage. In recent years, there have been growing calls for the Benin bronzes to be returned to Nigeria. Some museums have agreed, others have resisted, but the conversation has forced the world to confront uncomfortable truths about the ways in which history is preserved or taken. For now, the brass plaque Oba with Europeans remains a silent witness in a foreign land, but its image still carries the pride and complexity of the kingdom that made it. It reminds us that history is not always told by the victors alone. Sometimes, it is etched in metal by those who knew their worth and intended for their story to outlast the centuries. Hoa Kanaya. In the dim, quiet halls of the British Museum, among glass cases and softly lit galleries, there stands a figure that seems to look back at you with an expression both solemn and knowing. It is carved from basalt, its form weathered by wind, sea, and time, and its presence radiates the weight of centuries. This is Hoa Kanaya, a name that means stolen or hidden friend in the Rapa Nui language. At first glance, it might seem like just another example of the famous stone figures from Easter Island, the Moai. But as you stand before it, there's something different about this statue. It carries stories that are not carved on any plaque, stories that reach back into a world of ritual, migration, and mystery. Hoa Kanaya is not just a relic, it is a survivor of a culture that created one of the most remote monumental traditions on Earth. The Rapa Nui people, living thousands of miles from the nearest continent, raised hundreds of moai between the 13th and 17th centuries. These statues, with their elongated faces and solemn expressions, were more than mere sculptures. They were embodiments of ancestors, guardians set to watch over the living. And yet, Hoa Kanaya is different. It is smaller than many of its kin, standing a little over 2.5 meters tall, but its detail is exceptional, its surface etched with carvings unlike most others on the island. Those carvings tell another story, one of spiritual change. Experts believe that while many moai were plain, Hoa Kanaya's back is covered in intricate petroglyphs representing the Birdman cult, a religious shift that came after the moai building era. This cult centered around a yearly competition in which men would risk their lives swimming to a nearby islet to retrieve the first egg of a seabird, the sooty tern. The winner's clan would hold prestige for the year, and the Birdman himself would be honored as a semi-divine figure. On Hoa Kanaya's back you can see these Birdman figures, their stylized forms emerging from the stone. Some believe this statue was repurposed, that it began as a traditional moai but was later transformed into a sacred symbol for a new religious age. And then there's the journey it took, a journey that mirrors the fate of many cultural treasures. In 1868, a British naval expedition visited Easter Island. Hoa Kanaya was taken from the island and brought aboard the ship HMS Tapes. From there it traveled across oceans, eventually arriving in Britain. For the Rapa Nui people, the removal of the statue was more than just the loss of a stone carving, it was the displacement of a spiritual being. Today debates continue over whether such artifacts should be returned to their places of origin. For some visitors, the statue's presence in the British Museum is a chance to connect with a distant world. For others, it is a reminder of colonial removal, of sacred objects taken far from the land and people that gave them meaning. Standing in front of Hoa Kanaya, you can sense the layers of history pressing against each other. There is the volcanic rock from which it was carved, stone that began its life deep within the earth before erupting to the surface. There are the hands that shaped it, hands that knew the cultural codes and artistic styles of the Rapa Nui. There are the ceremonies that may have taken place in its shadow, the chants, the offerings, the quiet moments when someone might have stood before it, asking for guidance or protection. And then there is the silence of the ship's hold, as it crossed the Pacific, leaving behind the sound of waves on the island's rocky shore. Hoa Hakananaya is an artifact of contradictions. It is both familiar and strange, both a piece of art and a spiritual vessel, both preserved and displaced. Its name, Stolen Friend, seems to acknowledge this duality, and perhaps that's why it feels different from the other moai you may see in photographs. It's not just the details or the carvings, it's the sense that this statue has lived more than one life, carried more than one identity, and now stands in a place far from where it began, still holding the memory of the island in its stone. If you take your time, if you stand before it without rushing, you might notice how the museum's light catches its features. The long nose, the strong brow, the thin lips set in a line. You might imagine the open skies of Easter Island, the salt spray in the air, and the distant crash of waves on cliffs. You might feel the pull of a time when this figure was not a museum exhibit, but part of a living culture, a guardian watching over a community, and in that quiet moment, you might realize that Hoa Hakanaya is more than an ancient mystery. It is a reminder of how art, belief, and identity can travel, change, and survive. It is a testament to human creativity in one of the most isolated corners of the world, and a witness to the way that isolation can give rise to something utterly unique. Its story is still unfolding. The debates about repatriation, the studies into its carvings, the continuing oral traditions of the Rapa Nui, all of these are chapters yet to be written, and so Hoa Hakanaya stands, halfway between the past and the present, carrying its history in silence, waiting for the next person to look into its eyes and wonder where its true home might be. Icon of the triumph of orthodoxy. It rests in a quiet corner of the museum now, framed in a way that makes you step closer, almost without realizing it. The gold leaf catches the light, the deep reds and blues seem to hold their own glow, and the figures, solemn yet triumphant, stand frozen in a moment that changed the course of faith, politics, and art in the Byzantine world. The icon of the triumph of orthodoxy is not simply a painting on wood, it is the closing chapter of one of the fiercest and most divisive struggles in medieval Christianity, the Byzantine iconoclasm. To understand why this image exists and why it carries such deep meaning, we have to go back centuries, to a time when images were more than decoration, they were power, belief, and sometimes rebellion. In the Byzantine Empire of the 8th and 9th centuries, there was a storm brewing over what might seem, at first glance, like an almost strange debate: should religious images be allowed? For generations, Christians had created icons, painted images of Christ, the Virgin Mary, and the saints. These were not just art, they were venerated, kissed, prayed to, and carried into battle. They were seen as windows to the divine. But to some rulers and thinkers, this crossed a dangerous line. The argument was simple yet explosive. Were these icons sacred reminders, or idols? The first great wave of iconoclasm, the destruction of icons, began under Emperor Leo III in the year 726. Mosaics were scraped from church walls, icons were burned, and artists either hid their work or stopped creating altogether. Supporters of this movement believed they were purifying the faith, removing the danger of idolatry. Opponents saw it as a direct attack on the very heart of Christian worship and tradition. For decades, the empire swung between iconoclasts, those who rejected images, and iconodules, those who defended them. It was not just a theological fight, it was political, cultural, and deeply personal. Monks who painted icons risked exile, torture, or execution. Entire communities split over the question, and while emperors often set the tone, ordinary believers held fast to the images they loved, hiding them in walls, burying them for safekeeping, or smuggling them to safer regions. By the mid-9th century, the tide had turned. Empress Theodora, ruling as regent for her young son Michael III, declared the restoration of icons in 843. This was not just a religious decision, it was a statement of imperial authority, a moment of cultural rebirth, and so the triumph of orthodoxy was celebrated for the first time, a victory not through battle, but through the return of art, tradition, and the right to see the divine in painted form. The icon we see today captures that moment. At its center is the Virgin Mary, holding the Christ child, a common and deeply revered image in Byzantine art. Around them stand saints, bishops, and emperors who had defended the use of icons. Their faces are serene but purposeful, each gaze leading the viewer back to the central image. The background is covered in gold leaf, not as decoration, but as a symbol of heaven itself. Byzantine artists were not interested in creating realistic earthly scenes. Their icons were meant to open a window to eternity, a space where the holy and the human meet. Even the way the figures are painted, flat yet somehow full of presence, reminds us that this is not a scene unfolding in real time, but an eternal truth. One detail often overlooked is the way this icon serves as both history and propaganda. It records who was on the winning side of the controversy, shaping how future generations would remember the conflict. For the faithful, it was a reassurance. The icons were back, and they were here to stay. For the empire, it was a way of saying, our rule is aligned with God's will. Over the centuries, the Feast of the Triumph of Orthodoxy became an annual celebration in the Eastern Orthodox Church, marked every first Sunday of Lent. Processions carry icons through the streets, echoing that 9th-century victory, while sermons recall the courage of those who defended them. Even today, this icon is more than an artifact. It is a living tradition, still inspiring devotion. As you stand before it, time feels elastic. The paint may be centuries old, but the faces seem to meet your gaze in the present moment. The gold still shimmers, even in the dim light. You realize that this small wooden panel carries the weight of an empire's identity, the struggles of generations, and the joy of a victory that shaped an entire branch of Christianity. In that quiet moment, you are not just looking at an object behind glass. You are standing in the echo of a centuries-long battle over the very meaning of sacred art, and the belief that images could bring the divine closer to the human heart. Ife head, brass head of a ruler. In the still air of a quiet museum room, a single figure commands attention without uttering a sound. It is the face of a ruler, an ancient sovereign whose features were cast not in fragile clay or crumbling stone, but in warm, enduring brass. The Ife head, as it is known today, sits beneath the soft glow of display lights, but its true story reaches far beyond glass cases and white walls. It carries with it the legacy of an entire civilization, one that thrived long before modern maps were drawn. The ancient city of Ife, in what is now southwestern Nigeria, was not an isolated outpost hidden away in some forgotten corner of Africa. It was a vibrant, sophisticated center of trade, art, and spiritual life. Long before European ships appeared on West Africa's shores, Ife was already a city of streets, courtyards, palaces, and bustling markets. It was a place where the sound of blacksmiths hammering iron mingled with the hum of traders selling ivory, pepper, beads, and cloth. And it was here, in this royal heartland, that artisans produced some of the most extraordinary sculptures the world had ever seen. The Ife head was likely made between the 12th and 15th centuries, hundreds of years before the first Portuguese explorers set foot in this region. Yet when European archaeologists first saw it in the early 20th century, they struggled to believe it was truly African in origin. The smoothness of the metal, the lifelike proportions, the calm but commanding expression, it challenged every stereotype and prejudice they carried. How could such refined metalwork come from a place they wrongly assumed had no advanced art traditions? That disbelief, rooted in ignorance, says more about them than about the people of Ife. The head is just over life size, made using the lost wax casting technique, a method requiring patience, precision, and a deep knowledge of metallurgy. Every line and contour was planned with care. The soft swell of the cheeks, the smooth curve of the lips, the steady gaze that seems to meet yours without flinching. The face is covered with delicate vertical striations, thin, carved lines that run from the hairline down to the chin. No one knows for certain whether these markings represent scarification, ritual paint, or simply an artistic convention. What is clear is that they add a texture that catches the light, giving the face a quiet radiance. The crown, too, is significant. This was no ordinary headdress, but one worn by those with divine authority. In the Yoruba worldview, which shaped the kingdom of Ife, rulers were not just political figures, they were spiritual leaders, living links between the human realm and the gods. The ruler's role was to maintain harmony in the kingdom, to ensure that rituals were performed, and to keep the balance between earth and sky. When you stand before the Ife head today, you are not just looking at a portrait, you are looking at a declaration of sacred kingship. Many historians believe the head was part of a full-body figure, perhaps displayed in a palace shrine, or used during royal ceremonies. It may have been created to honor a specific ruler, preserving their likeness for generations to come. Others suggest it might have represented an idealized image of kingship itself, timeless, perfect, beyond the flaws of any single person. The mystery deepened in 1938, when a farmer near Ife unearthed a cache of similar brass and terracotta heads. Suddenly scholars realized this was not an isolated masterpiece, but part of a vast artistic tradition. Each head had its own expression, its own subtle differences, as if each ruler had been given a face in eternity. Some had holes around the neck, suggesting they were once attached to wooden bodies that have long since decayed. Others bore traces of pigment, hinting that they might once have been painted in vivid colors, their metallic surfaces glowing under ritual light. The craftsmanship was so advanced that some early European researchers tried to claim the heads must have been made by outsiders. Phoenicians, Greeks, even lost survivors of Atlantis. It was easier for them to imagine an ancient traveler bringing these skills to Africa than to admit that African civilizations had their own genius. Today we know the truth. These were the works of Yoruba artisans, trained in techniques passed down through generations, drawing on knowledge that had nothing to do with outside influence. The Ife head is more than a work of art. It is a rebuke to every history book that once ignored Africa's achievements. It is evidence that great cities, complex societies, and world-class craftsmanship existed here centuries before colonial narratives began. When you look into its calm eyes, you are meeting a ruler who has watched empires rise and fall, who has outlasted kingdoms, wars, and borders. The brass has not rusted, the gaze has not wavered. Today, many Ife heads are displayed in museums far from Nigeria, often in institutions that acquired them during the colonial era. The British Museum, for example, holds some of the most famous examples, but the people of Ife, and the Yoruba community as a whole, have never forgotten where these pieces came from or the ancestors they represent. Debates over repatriation continue, as voices grow louder calling for the return of these treasures to the land that gave them life. Standing in front of the Ife head, one might feel a strange quiet. It's the kind of silence that belongs not to emptiness, but to presence. A presence that feels alive, as if the ruler is still watching, still judging, still guiding, and in that moment you understand. This is not just a head of brass. It is the face of dignity. It is history staring back. It is proof that the stories of Africa are not just footnotes in the world's history, they are chapters in their own right, written in metal and memory. Recreation game board. Chess, 1901. If you've ever sat across from someone at a chessboard, you already know the quiet tension it brings. 2 players, 1 board, 32 pieces, and an entire world of strategy contained within 64 squares. But the chessboard in question here is not just any chessboard. This is a piece from the year 1901, from the Life Photo Collection archives, and while that may not sound particularly ancient at first glance, its story stretches back far beyond the turn of the 20th century. It's not only about the object itself, but about the centuries of human history that live inside the rules, symbols, and movements of the game it represents. The board is made with precision, perfectly alternating light and dark squares, its surface showing signs of careful use. The pieces, too, have their own weight and texture, crafted with an elegance that speaks of a time when objects were made to last. This is the kind of chess set you could imagine being handed down across generations, each player adding their own subtle wear to the smoothness of the pieces, each match adding another layer to its unspoken history. Now, chess as a game has origins that stretch back more than a millennium. Its earliest ancestor was chaturanga, a strategic game from India played sometime around the 6th century. From there, the game traveled through Persia, where it became shatranj, and then through trade and conquest, it reached the Islamic world and medieval Europe. Over the centuries, the rules shifted, the pieces evolved, and the game became faster, more dynamic, until it became the chess we recognize today. The 1901 chessboard in the Life Photo Collection is more than just wood and polish. It's an object frozen in a moment when chess had already conquered much of the world. By the early 20th century, chess clubs were sprouting in cities, tournaments were being recorded, and the game had stepped firmly into the realm of intellectual sport. But the interesting part, this was also the era when chess began appearing in photographs, printed media, and even early films. It was no longer just a game played quietly at home, it had become part of a cultural identity. The board itself carries with it the quiet dignity of slow, deliberate play. Imagine the soft clink of a carved rook meeting the wooden square, the faint scrape as a knight moves from one position to another, the moments of silence that hang in the air as one player considers their next move, calculating, anticipating, and trying to stay 3 moves ahead. Chess has always been a game of minds, but in 1901 it was also still a game of manners. Players would sit across from one another in formal dress, posture straight, faces composed not just to hide their strategy, but because the match was as much a social ritual as it was a competition. There's also a deeper symbolism to this board. Every chess game is a miniature battle, a reflection of strategy, politics, and warfare. The pawns, the expendable foot soldiers, the rooks, the fortresses holding the corners, the knights, the unpredictable cavalry, the bishops, the religious or political advisors, and at the center, the king and queen, 2 opposing powers, each surrounded by their court, each trying to outmaneuver the other. In that way, a chessboard is almost like a stage. Each game is its own play, unique, unpredictable, and never exactly the same twice. And this 1901 board, held in the Life archives, is like a preserved theater, ready to host endless dramas, if only someone would set the pieces in motion again. The early 20th century was also a time of change for the game. In 1924, just a few decades after this board was crafted, FIDE, the World Chess Federation, was established, formalizing the global structure of the game. But in 1901, chess still belonged to the clubs, the coffee houses, and the living rooms of dedicated players. It was a slower world without digital timers or online opponents. A single match could last hours, sometimes even days, and every move mattered. I like to imagine this particular board having witnessed dozens, maybe hundreds of matches. some of them quiet and thoughtful, others perhaps tense, where the players leaned in close, their eyes fixed on the pieces, the air heavy with competition. Maybe it sat in a study, with a small oil lamp casting light over its surface. Maybe it was part of a parlor game in a grand home, where guests would watch over the players' shoulders, whispering about who might win. Or maybe it was just a quiet companion for two friends who met every week to talk, laugh, and think their way across the board. Artifacts like this are fascinating because they are so familiar. We still use chessboards today, yet each historical one feels unique. It holds not only the shape of the game, but the memories of those who touched it. Every worn edge is a reminder that these were real games, played by real people, in a time before us. And here's the thing about chess. It's one of the few games that truly connects us across centuries. The same moves that could be played on this board in 1901 could be played exactly the same way today. You could sit down with someone from another country, another culture, and without sharing a language, you could share a game. The rules haven't changed in over 100 years. The strategies remain familiar. The satisfaction of a well-executed checkmate is as timeless as ever. Looking at the 1901 recreation game board now, it's easy to think of it as just an object. But when you step back, you realize it's also a bridge, a connection between people of the past and present, between quiet evenings in 1901 and the games we still play today. And maybe that's the magic of artifacts like this. They remind us that even across decades or centuries, some things never lose their charm, some games never stop challenging us, and some boards, like this one, never truly stop playing. The Silk Princess Painting. In the quiet halls of history, where the air feels heavy with the breath of centuries, there hangs a painting that has traveled far more than most people will in their entire lives. It is known as the Silk Princess Painting, and while its colors are soft and its figures delicate, the story it carries is anything but ordinary. This is not just a piece of art, it is a window into a turning point in human history, when a secret guarded for thousands of years slipped quietly into the wider world. At first glance, the Silk Princess painting looks serene, almost gentle. The brushstrokes are fine, the details precise. You see a noblewoman, her posture dignified, her clothing layered in elegance. Around her are attendants, figures who seem both respectful and protective. But what makes this scene remarkable is not just who she is, it's what she carries in her hands. The woman in the painting is believed to be a Chinese princess from the ancient Tang dynasty, a time when China was a center of culture, innovation, and wealth. The object she holds is not a weapon, not gold, not a jewel. It is something far more valuable, silkworm eggs, carefully hidden, in her clothing, in her hair ornaments, perhaps even sewn into the hem of her robe. These tiny creatures were smuggled out of China in one of the greatest acts of economic espionage the world has ever known. For thousands of years, silk was China's most closely guarded secret. It was not just a fabric, it was a currency, a status symbol, a thread that linked emperors and merchants, soldiers and scholars. To wear silk was to carry a piece of the empire's soul. The Chinese guarded the production process fiercely. The penalty for taking silkworms or their eggs out of the empire was death. And yet, the Silk Princess dared to break this law. Legend says she was sent to marry a foreign king, possibly from the region that is now part of Central Asia. As part of the marriage alliance, she was expected to bring wealth and status to her new home. But she brought something far greater, a living secret. Her journey would have been long and dangerous, traveling through deserts, over mountains, past territories controlled by warlords and traders. Every step was a risk, not just for her, but for the fragile life she carried with her. The painting captures a moment that history cannot record in exact detail, the moment between the known and the unknown, between loyalty to her homeland and the pull of a new life. We do not know if she hesitated, if she feared discovery, if she wondered whether the silkworms would even survive the journey. All we know is that by the time she reached her new kingdom, the world was about to change. From those hidden eggs came the first silkworm farms outside of China. The knowledge spread, slowly at first, then rapidly along the Silk Road. Persia, Byzantium, and eventually Europe would learn the secrets of sericulture, how to raise silkworms, how to harvest their delicate threads, how to spin them into shimmering cloth. The monopoly that had made China unimaginably wealthy began to fade, replaced by a new global exchange. And yet the Silk Princess painting is not just a story of trade and technology. It is a story about choice, about one woman who carried, quite literally, the seeds of transformation. Did she act willingly, out of ambition for her new life? Or was she ordered by her family or her new husband? Was she praised as a bringer of prosperity, or did she live in fear of the consequences if her secret had been discovered before she crossed the border? We may never know. The painting offers no answers, only the stillness of her face, the grace of her hands, and the quiet sense that she knows something no one else in the scene fully understands. Her expression is neither defiant nor meek. It is calm, as though she has accepted the weight of her role. The silk itself, once it reached foreign hands, would take on meanings the princess could never have predicted. It would clothe emperors in Byzantium, adorn saints in medieval churches, and become the backdrop for some of the greatest tapestries of the Renaissance. It would be used in trade deals, as diplomatic gifts, even as a form of tribute, and all of it began with an act of concealment and courage. Standing before the silk princess painting today, it is easy to forget how many threads, both literal and symbolic, connect us to her story. You see the gentle folds of her robe and the rich pigments of the paint, but you also see the invisible lines that stretch across centuries, linking the silkworms she carried to the garments we still wear today. In that sense, she is still with us, not just in museums and history books, but in the fabric of our daily lives. The silk princess painting is more than art. It is a silent witness to a moment when the course of global trade shifted forever, and like the finest silk, its story is strong enough to endure the passage of time, yet delicate enough to make us pause, lean closer, and wonder at the courage it took to carry the smallest of secrets across the largest of worlds. Sutton Hoo Ship Burial Helmet. If you walk into the British Museum today, tucked behind glass and softly lit to protect it from the slow damage of light and time, you'll see something that at first glance almost feels like a prop from a medieval legend. But it's no fantasy. This is the Sutton Hoo Ship Burial Helmet, one of the most iconic archaeological discoveries in British history. And yet, for all the studies, all the reconstructions, and all the books written about it, the helmet still holds secrets. The story of this helmet begins not in the museum, but in a quiet stretch of land in Suffolk, England. The place is called Sutton Hoo. The land here is undulating, with grassy mounds that for centuries locals had simply thought of as odd little hills. They are burial mounds, remnants of an ancient past that few understood, and for a long time, no one disturbed them. But in 1938, a woman named Edith Pretty, who owned the estate, began to wonder what lay beneath one of the largest mounds. She had seen workers dig in the area before, and she had a curiosity that wouldn't let her ignore the strange shapes in her own backyard. She contacted an amateur archaeologist named Basil Brown, a quiet, determined man who preferred bicycles to cars and had an instinct for reading the ground like a book. In 1939, Brown and his small team began to dig. As they worked carefully through the soil, they realized they were not uncovering a small grave or a modest structure, they were finding the ghostly imprint of something enormous. The earth preserved the outline of a full-sized ship, about 27 meters long. Ships, of course, do not survive in soil for over 1,000 years, not their wood at least. What was left was a dark stain in the earth, the trace of each plank and rib. It was as if the ship had left a shadow of itself. At its center they found a burial chamber, and in that chamber treasures emerged. Weapons, gold, silver, textiles, and ceremonial objects, all the things that might accompany a great person into the afterlife. Among those treasures was the helmet, although at first it wasn't a helmet at all. What they pulled from the soil were hundreds of fragments of corroded iron, rusted, fragile, and stuck together in clumps. They looked like little more than metal debris, but piece by painstaking piece, conservators later fitted them together like a three-dimensional puzzle. Slowly, the helmet's shape emerged. The Sutton Hoo helmet is unlike most other helmets from Anglo-Saxon England. It is elaborately decorated, covered in intricate designs. The iron frame is inlaid with tinned bronze, giving the appearance of silver. The faceplate is perhaps its most striking feature. It has eyebrows, a nose, and a stylized mustache, forming a mask-like visage. If you look closely at the eyebrows, they turn into dragon heads at the ends, a detail so small that it might have been missed without careful reconstruction. The nose and mustache form part of a bird motif, a design element found in other early medieval art. The craftsmanship tells us this was no ordinary warrior's headgear. This helmet was ceremonial, a symbol of power and rank. But whose head did it protect, and why was it buried in such a grand way? The leading theory is that the grave belonged to a powerful Anglo-Saxon king, perhaps Radwald, the ruler of East Anglia in the early 7th century. The lavishness of the burial fits the status of such a man, and yet no body was ever found. Whether the acidic soil dissolved it completely, or whether the grave was a cenotaph, a symbolic burial without remains, is still debated. There's also the question of symbolism. The Sutton Hoo helmet, like many ceremonial objects, would have been more than armor. It would have been a statement, a projection of identity. The face mask could turn the wearer into something larger than life, part man, part mythical warrior, part divine protector. In an age where kings had to be warriors and warlords had to be leaders, this kind of transformation was a powerful tool. And then there is the ship itself. Ship burials are rare in Anglo-Saxon England but common in Scandinavian culture. The size of the Sutton Hoo ship and the treasures it contained have led many to suggest that the East Anglian kings were deeply connected to the wider world of the North Sea, trading, exchanging gifts, and perhaps even intermarrying with other royal families. The Sutton Hoo burial speaks of a world where England was not isolated, but part of a vast network of kingdoms and cultures. When the helmet was reconstructed and put on display, it quickly became an icon of early medieval England. Its stern, mask-like face stares back at you with a kind of silent authority. You can almost imagine it worn during a ceremonial procession, the sunlight flashing off its silvered surface, the man beneath it gazing at his subjects or his warriors, with eyes hidden in shadow. But here's the mystery. If the Sutton Hoo burial was meant to immortalize a ruler, why was it left untouched for over 1,300 years? Was it forgotten, or was it deliberately left alone, out of respect, fear, or superstition? No written records survive to explain it. All we have is the mound, the ship's shadow in the earth, and the treasures it once protected. Today, standing before the helmet in the museum, you feel a strange connection to that lost world. It's more than just a relic. It's a reminder that even in times we think of as dark or primitive, people valued artistry, symbolism, and legacy. The Sutton Hoo helmet is not just about protection in battle, it's about being remembered, and perhaps in that sense it has succeeded. The bronze hand. There is something quietly haunting about the way metal can outlast memory. When you stand before an object like the bronze hand, dated between 100 and 299 AD, you're not just looking at a preserved piece of metal, you're looking at a fragment of someone's life, a moment from a world that has long dissolved into dust. This hand is not a random piece of bronze. It is shaped with purpose, crafted with skill, and most importantly, it is human in its form, carrying all the subtle signs that it was meant to mean something to the people who made it. The bronze hand was discovered in a place that, in its time, would have been remote even to the people who lived there. It is believed to have been created somewhere in the region we now think of as the western edges of the Roman Empire, possibly within a tribal or frontier community. But the story of this hand is not straightforward, and that is where its mystery begins. When archaeologists first uncovered it, they noticed immediately that it was not a flat or lifeless casting. The fingers were delicately shaped, slightly curled inwards, as if in the act of holding something. The palm had a natural curve, and even the texture bore marks of intentional craftsmanship. Whoever made it took the time to make it feel lifelike. This wasn't just an ornament, it was an object with meaning. The most widely accepted theory is that the bronze hand may have been used in a religious or ceremonial context. In many ancient cultures, the hand symbolized protection, power, or divine authority. A raised hand could be a gesture of blessing, a ward against evil, or a sign of command. But this particular hand seems to have been crafted for more than just display. Some scholars believe it might have been attached to a larger statue or a ritual staff. Imagine it, perhaps, raised high during gatherings, glinting in torchlight, a silent but powerful presence in the ritual drama of the ancient world. The dating of the artifact between the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD places it in a turbulent time. Across Europe and the edges of the Roman world, cultures were shifting, colliding, and blending. The Roman Empire was at its peak in some areas, but at its edges, there were communities living in the shadow of that power, absorbing some influences while holding fiercely onto their traditions. The bronze hand may have been part of this cultural crossroads, a Roman-inspired work made by local artisans, or a wholly native creation that borrowed some design cues from the wider world. When you hold that in your mind, the object becomes even more fascinating. Was it carried by a tribal leader as a symbol of authority? Was it offered to the gods in a temple now long gone? Or was it a piece of a traveling talisman, passed down through generations before being lost or buried? We cannot know for certain, but each theory adds a layer of depth to its presence. The craftsmanship also raises questions about the society that made it. Bronze work of this level required skill, resources, and time, things not given lightly in ancient communities. Bronze was valuable, and melting and shaping it into an anatomically convincing hand would have been a deliberate choice. This was not a tool, a weapon, or a piece of functional equipment. This was art, symbolism, and possibly magic, all cast in one piece. One particularly intriguing possibility is that the bronze hand could have been connected to warrior culture. Some ancient societies used stylized body parts as symbols of victory or divine favor in battle. A hand could represent the strength of warriors, the grasp of leadership, or even the favor of a war god. If this is true, then the hand might have been displayed in a leader's hall or carried in military ceremonies, a constant reminder that strength and authority went hand in hand. But the most mysterious element of all is what's missing. The hand is alone. If it was part of a larger object, where is the rest? Was it broken during conflict and discarded? Was it buried intentionally, perhaps as part of a ritual offering? Or was it hidden away for safekeeping, only to be forgotten until the day it was found centuries later? Even in its stillness, the bronze hand speaks. It carries the ghost of the person who cast it, the people who revered it, and the culture that gave it meaning. And yet, it leaves us with nothing but questions. That is the paradox of ancient artifacts. They are both answers and mysteries at the same time. When you stand before it in the museum, you notice its surface catching the light, revealing a patina earned through centuries of silent endurance. You realize that you are looking at something that has survived wars, migrations, and the slow erosion of history. It is an object that has no voice, and yet it has a story, one we can only piece together through imagination, research, and the fragile clues left behind. The bronze hand is a reminder that even in the smallest of objects, entire worlds can be hidden. We may never know exactly why it was made, or what it held in its symbolic grasp, but perhaps that is what makes it powerful. Its mystery invites us to keep looking, to keep questioning, and to keep reaching, much like the hand itself, into the depths of the past. The Hinton St Mary Mosaic. In the quiet village of Hinton St Mary in Dorset, England, there lies a story set in stone, quite literally. Beneath the gentle fields and small country lanes, archaeologists once uncovered a floor that had been hidden for over 1,000 years. It was not just any floor, but a Roman mosaic intricately crafted, astonishingly preserved, and filled with clues about the people who once lived here. The discovery was made in 1963, in what seemed at first to be an ordinary patch of ground, no grand ruins above it, no towering columns or crumbling walls to suggest anything remarkable, just a field, in a village where time moved slowly. But when the first stones of the design began to emerge from the earth, it became clear that this was a piece of the past that had been waiting patiently to be seen again. The mosaic's central figure has puzzled historians for decades. At first glance, it appears to be a young man with a halo-like shape around his head, holding what could be a scroll. Some believe this is Christ, possibly the earliest known representation of him in Britain. If that's true, it would make this floor not just an example of Roman craftsmanship, but also a rare and significant Christian relic from a time when Christianity was still spreading quietly across the empire. Others, however, argue that the figure may represent a Roman emperor, or even a local leader depicted in divine style. In the absence of inscriptions or records, the mosaic leaves us to wonder, much as its makers perhaps intended. Around this central portrait, geometric designs fill the space in perfect symmetry. Each tiny stone, called a tessera, was hand-cut and placed with careful precision. It is thought that the villa owner who commissioned it would have been a person of considerable wealth, able to afford skilled artisans and expensive materials. Some of the tessera are made from local stone, while others were brought from far-off regions, suggesting trade connections that reached well beyond Dorset. Walking across it in its prime must have been like stepping into a painting, colors gleaming in the light, shapes guiding the eyes from one detail to another. The location of the mosaic is as intriguing as the art itself. Hinton St Mary, during the Roman period, was a rural settlement, quiet farmland dotted with villas. Unlike the bustling cities of Roman Britain, such as Londinium or Verulamium, this was a peaceful corner of the province. And yet here, hidden in a countryside home, someone felt the need to place such a work of symbolic and spiritual power. Was it meant to impress visitors? Was it a private act of devotion? Or was it simply a reflection of wealth and fashion? The discovery in 1963 was nothing short of a race against time. Construction work was planned in the area, and without the quick intervention of archaeologists, the mosaic might have been damaged or destroyed. Once uncovered, it was carefully lifted and moved to the British Museum, where it remains one of the most visited treasures in the Roman Britain Gallery. There, under controlled light, visitors can still see the crispness of the designs and the delicate shading that gives the central face its lifelike quality. Theories about the mosaic's meaning continue to evolve. For those who see Christ in the portrait, this floor becomes a window into a moment when Christianity was taking root in Britain, decades before it would be embraced as the official religion of the empire. If that is correct, it could mean that the villa's owner was among the earliest Christian converts in the region, practicing his faith discreetly within the safety of his private home. The halo, the scroll, and the serene expression all seem to echo early Christian imagery found elsewhere in the empire. Yet for others, the absence of direct Christian symbols, such as the cross or explicit inscriptions, makes the identification less certain. In their view, the figure could be a youthful Apollo, the sun god, whose image was popular in Roman art. The halo, in that case, would be the sun's radiance, a common motif long before Christian art adopted it. This ambiguity is part of what makes the Hinton St Mary mosaic so compelling. It refuses to be pinned down, holding onto its mystery even after centuries of study. When we imagine the day it was completed, it's easy to picture the artisans stepping back, dusting their hands, and admiring the way the stones caught the light. The villa owner would have stood there too, proud of the work, perhaps inviting friends and family to see it for the first time. The floor would have felt cool under bare feet in the summer, the designs offering both beauty and conversation for guests. Over time, however, as the Roman world in Britain began to fade, the villa fell silent. Roofs collapsed, walls crumbled, and soil slowly covered the art. The face in the center waited, centuries passing in darkness until the day a shovel struck stone, and history emerged once more. Now, as people from around the world walk past it in the museum, they see not only the skill of Roman mosaicists, but also the deep currents of cultural and religious change in ancient Britain. Some stop to read the debates about who the figure might be. Others simply gaze at the calm eyes, feeling a connection across time. The Hinton St. Mary mosaic is more than just a floor. It is a story set in stone, part Roman, part British, part Christian, part pagan, and entirely a testament to the layered history beneath our feet. Ceremonial ballgame belt. In the quiet stillness of ancient Mesoamerica, long before the rise of steel cities and modern stadiums, there was a game, one unlike anything we know today. It was not played for fun alone. It was a ritual, a ceremony, a test of skill, endurance, and in some cases, fate. At the center of this ancient tradition stood an object as mysterious as it was symbolic, the ceremonial ballgame belt. This was not a belt in the ordinary sense. Not something meant simply to hold up garments or mark a status of fashion. Instead, it was a carved, often heavy piece of stone, sometimes made of wood or even precious materials, worn around the waist by players in an ancient ballgame that was both sport and sacred act. The belt was curved, rigid, and thick, designed to protect the midsection, or perhaps to make striking the ball with the body possible. The shape often mimicked the letter U, or a wide arc, with ends that flared outward. To the people who crafted it, the belt was not just sports equipment, it was a tool in a cosmic performance. The game in which this belt played a role is thought to have been invented over 3,000 years ago. Its name in various languages of Mesoamerica changes from region to region, but archaeologists often refer to it as the Mesoamerican ball game. The rules varied. In some versions, the goal was to keep a heavy rubber ball in play, without using hands or feet, only the hips, thighs, and upper body. Imagine the difficulty of that. A ball that could weigh several kilograms, striking against a belt or hip, rebounding just enough to send it toward a stone ring or into the opposing team's zone. To us today, it sounds like an unusual sport, but to the ancient Maya, Olmec, and Aztec, it was a reflection of the heavens. The ball itself represented the sun, the moon, or even the movement of the stars. The court became the cosmos, the boundaries marking the edges of the known world, and the players became stand-ins for gods and heroes battling for balance in the universe. When we look closely at ceremonial ballgame belts that have survived, we see intricate carvings, snakes curling along the edges, stylized faces, swirling patterns that could be clouds, flames, or even representations of the underworld. These were not decoration for vanity's sake. They were coded messages, symbols that the players carried as they performed a sacred drama before their community. Some belts show warriors, others depict mythical creatures or deities. These designs remind us that the game was tied deeply to religious and political power. It is easy to imagine the scene. The court, an open-air stone arena, lined with sloped walls. The air is hot, shimmering in the midday sun. The crowd gathers, men, women, children, nobles, and priests, filling the space with an electric anticipation. Two teams take their places, each wearing belts. Some are functional, meant to take the full impact of the ball. Others, like the ceremonial belt we speak of now, may never have been worn in play but instead served as a symbol of victory or authority. For some communities, the outcome of the game determined more than bragging rights. It could decide the fate of alliances, the terms of trade, or even the survival of a ruler's reign. And in the more chilling versions of history, it could mean that the losing team, or even the winning captain, would be offered as a sacrifice to the gods. In this way, the ceremonial belt was both a badge of honor and a reminder of mortality. The craftsmanship of these belts tells another story, one of artistry and devotion. Stone belts, sometimes weighing up to 20 kilograms, were shaped by hand using simple tools. The carving process could take weeks or even months. The artisans who made them were not merely workers, they were keepers of tradition, tasked with translating spiritual beliefs into physical form. The choice of material mattered greatly. Basalt, jade, limestone. Each carried its own meaning. Jade, for example, was tied to life, fertility, and prestige. A jade ceremonial belt would not have been for an ordinary player. Some scholars believe that these ceremonial belts were not worn at all during matches. Instead, they were symbols presented at rituals, perhaps as trophies for victors or as grave goods for important individuals who had played in the game during their lifetime. In some burials, we find belts placed beside the body, their curved form cradling the bones, as if still wrapped around the waist of the person in death, as in life. Archaeological digs have revealed these belts in surprising places, deep within temples, buried beneath layers of ceremonial offerings, hidden in caves, or placed at the base of ball courts as if to strengthen the link between the structure and the spiritual world. The ceremonial ballgame belt invites us to ask questions. Was it meant to be a practical tool for the game, or purely a ceremonial object, never to be used in the dusty heat of the court? Were the carvings instructions to the wearer, prayers, or protective charms? Or were they messages for the gods, to be read during the movements of the match? When you think about it, this single object connects countless threads of history. It ties together sport, religion, politics, art, and even the concept of life and death. It is proof that in the ancient world, there was little separation between the physical and the spiritual. Every movement, every object, every game could carry meaning far beyond what we see today. Now imagine holding one of these belts in your hands, the cool, heavy stone pressing into your palms. You run your fingers over the carvings, each line telling a story of the people who made it and the players who once wore it or revered it. You feel the weight, not just of the stone, but of centuries of tradition and belief. The ceremonial ballgame belt may never reveal all of its secrets. It may remain, like the game itself, half understood, a relic of a culture whose way of life was rich, complex, and deeply connected to forces they believed ruled the universe. But that is the beauty of such an artifact. It speaks just enough for us to hear an echo of its world, while still keeping its deepest truths hidden. The Warren Cup. In the quiet, dimly lit galleries of the British Museum, there is an object that is as striking for its artistry as it is for the conversations it has inspired. The Warren Cup, a small yet exquisitely crafted silver vessel, dates to the early Roman Empire, likely between the 1st century BCE and the 1st century CE. At first glance, it is a finely made drinking cup, its surface shining softly under the display lights, but closer inspection reveals something far more complex, a depiction of intimate scenes between male figures, rendered in remarkable detail. The Warren Cup story begins in a time when the Roman world stretched across Europe, North Africa, and the Near East. This was an age when luxury objects were not just functional, they were statements of wealth, taste, and identity. The cup was made using high-quality silver, shaped into a deep, rounded form, perfect for holding wine during a banquet. Its walls were decorated using a technique called repoussé, in which the images were hammered from the reverse side of the metal to create a raised, three-dimensional effect. The craftsmanship was so refined that each muscle, fold of fabric, and expression is still visible nearly 2,000 years later. The scenes on the Warren Cup are what have made it both famous and controversial. They depict two moments of same-sex intimacy, set against the backdrop of Roman domestic architecture. In one panel, a bearded man reclines with a younger, clean-shaven partner. In another, two youthful figures are engaged in an embrace. These were not unusual subjects in certain circles of Roman society, especially among the elite, where expressions of affection and eroticism were openly depicted in art. But for modern audiences, the images provoke debates about history, morality, and the shifting boundaries of what is considered acceptable to display. The cup's name comes from Edward Perry Warren, an American art collector who acquired it in the early 20th century. Warren, a man fascinated by ancient art and its depictions of love and beauty, kept the cup in his private collection for many years. He understood the rarity of such a well-preserved Roman object, but he also knew that its subject matter would cause controversy if shown publicly in his time. Indeed, when the cup eventually came onto the market decades later, major institutions hesitated to acquire it, not because of doubts about its authenticity, but because of its explicit imagery. It wasn't until the early 2000s that the British Museum finally purchased the Warren Cup, after years of debate. Its acquisition sparked headlines and public discussion, but it also provided an opportunity for historians to re-examine Roman attitudes toward love, desire, and relationships. To the Romans, depictions like those on the cup were not inherently scandalous. They reflected a world where art celebrated human connections in many forms, where boundaries between private and public expression were different from our own. The Warren Cup also offers insight into the social rituals of Roman dining. Banquets, convivia, were central to elite life. Guests would recline on couches, share food and drink, and engage in philosophical conversation, poetry, and music. Beautiful vessels like the Warren Cup were part of this experience, enhancing the atmosphere and displaying the host's refinement. Drinking cups often featured mythological scenes, hunting scenes, or scenes of daily life, but the explicit scenes on the Warren Cup suggest that it may have belonged to a private circle where such imagery was appreciated for both its artistry and its suggestive themes. The craftsmanship of the cup tells us about the skills of Roman silversmiths, who were able to work precious metals into thin, durable forms without losing structural strength. The repoussé technique required extraordinary precision. Too much pressure could tear the silver. Too little would leave the designs shallow and lifeless. The result here is astonishing. Folds of drapery that seem to ripple in motion, bodies that convey tension and intimacy, and architectural details that situate the scenes in a believable domestic space. Beyond its artistry, the Warren Cup has become a touchstone for discussions about representation in history. For centuries, same-sex relationships in the ancient world were downplayed or erased in historical narratives. Objects like this cup challenge those omissions, reminding us that human experiences and relationships have always been complex and diverse. The Warren Cup does not simply depict intimacy, it preserves a cultural moment, a reflection of values and expressions that existed long before modern categories and debates. Today, the Warren Cup sits in a glass case, open to all who wish to see it. Some visitors are drawn to its beauty, others to its controversy, and still others to the historical insight it offers. It is at once a work of art, an archaeological treasure, and a cultural document. In its silver surface, we glimpse the hands of an ancient craftsman, the laughter and conversation of a Roman banquet, and the enduring human stories that connect past and present. Even in the quiet of the museum, the Warren Cup continues to speak. Not only about Rome's artistry, but about the ways we understand history itself. It challenges us to see the ancient world, not as a distant, sanitized version of the present, but as a place filled with human complexity, where beauty, desire, and identity were expressed in ways that still resonate 2 millennia later. Head of Augustus. In the quiet halls of the museum, bathed in soft light, there rests a face carved from marble that has watched the centuries unfold in silence. The head of Augustus, an image of the man who became Rome's first emperor. The figure who transformed a fractured republic into an empire that would shape the course of Western history. This head is not merely a likeness, it is a carefully crafted symbol. Every curve of the cheek, every measured line of the jaw, and every calm, calculating gaze is a statement of power, stability, and permanence. It is easy to think of Augustus as just another ancient ruler, but in truth, he was far more than that. Born as Gaius Octavius, he began life as an unassuming young man, from a respected but not overly distinguished family. Yet, through a combination of intelligence, political skill, and the fortune of being the adopted heir of Julius Caesar, he rose to become the most powerful man in the known world. The marble head before us is a physical remnant of that transformation, a fragment of a much larger statue that once stood proudly in a public space, projecting an image of the emperor as eternally youthful and divinely favored. The sculptor's hand was guided not just by artistry but by politics. Augustus understood the value of imagery better than almost any leader before him. He didn't want to be remembered as a brutal conqueror or a fleeting figure of chaos. Instead, he crafted his public image as the bringer of peace, the restorer of Rome's greatness, the man who ended decades of civil war. In this head we see none of the strain or fatigue of a man who spent his early years navigating political assassinations, betrayal, and war. Instead, we see serenity, smooth skin, idealized proportions, and eyes that look slightly beyond us, toward a future only he could envision. The head's survival is a story in itself. Statues in the ancient world were not simply admired, they were statements of loyalty and legitimacy. When political tides shifted, so too did the fate of these works of art. Many were destroyed, their features hacked away by those who wanted to erase a ruler's memory. Yet somehow, this head endured. Perhaps it was buried during a time of danger, hidden by those who still admired him. Or perhaps it simply lay forgotten beneath centuries of soil, waiting to be rediscovered. As we study its details, it is worth imagining the world in which it once stood. Picture a Roman forum, bustling with merchants and citizens, the sound of sandals striking stone, the air alive with debate and rumor. High above the crowd, the statue of Augustus would have looked down, its unblinking eyes a constant reminder of Rome's power and unity under his rule. In this way, art and politics were inseparable, marble and empire intertwined. But this head also carries a deeper story, one about the nature of leadership and the shaping of memory. Augustus ruled for over 4 decades, a remarkable feat in a time when power was often short-lived and bloody. His reign brought roads, aqueducts, monumental architecture, and a new sense of stability. Yet it also relied on control over the Senate, over the provinces, and over how history would remember him. This marble portrait was part of that effort, a tool in the careful construction of a legacy. Today it rests in stillness, far from the Roman streets where it once stood. It is silent, but it speaks volumes. In its idealized features, we see how the ancients used art to project power. In its survival, we see the strange journey of objects through time, how a piece of marble can outlast empires, revolutions, and centuries of human change. If you stand before it long enough, you may begin to feel the weight of history pressing in. You may see the faint glint of ambition in those carved eyes, and hear the distant echo of Roman voices. And in that quiet, you might realize that Augustus's power, though long gone, still lingers, not in armies or laws, but in stone. It is here that we leave him. not as a ruler seated on a throne, but as a face frozen in marble, forever calm, forever watchful. A reminder of how the ancient world shaped its leaders into legends, and how those legends continue to watch over us from across the ages. Sphinx of Taharqa. In the softly lit halls of the British Museum, there is an object that seems to hold an entire empire in its silent gaze. Resting behind protective glass, it is not the size of the Great Sphinx of Giza, nor is it carved in the sheer scale of Egypt's colossal monuments. Yet it carries with it the weight of a king's ambition, the pride of a civilization, and the quiet resilience of a ruler who stood at the crossroads of two worlds. This is the Sphinx of Taharqa, a small but powerful sculpture from the 7th century BCE, carved during one of the most fascinating and often overlooked chapters of ancient history. The man it represents, King Taharqa, was no ordinary ruler. He was a pharaoh of Egypt, but his origins lay further south, in the rich and fertile lands of Nubia, in what is today northern Sudan. He belonged to the 25th dynasty of Egypt, often called the Kushite dynasty, a period when kings from the kingdom of Kush traveled north along the Nile and claimed the throne of Egypt itself. For centuries, Egypt had been the dominant power in the Nile Valley, influencing Nubia through trade, conquest, and culture. But by Taharqa's time, the balance of power had shifted. The Kushites, strong and wealthy from controlling trade routes deep into Africa, had grown into a kingdom capable of taking Egypt's crown. The Sphinx of Taharqa, though far smaller than the gigantic lions of stone that guard the desert, is striking in its detail. The body is that of a lion, the universal symbol of power and protection in the ancient world, and the head is human, modeled with features that reflect both Egyptian tradition and African heritage. This blending is no accident. It tells a story of a ruler who was determined to be seen as both an Egyptian pharaoh and a proud Nubian king. When you look closely, the face is calm but commanding. The eyes are almond-shaped, gazing forward with a sense of eternal watchfulness. The nose is broad, the lips full, unmistakably reflecting Taharqa's Nubian ancestry. Around his head, carved in stone, is the traditional pharaonic headcloth, the nemes, complete with the cobra, or uraeus, symbolizing divine kingship and protection. Every line, every proportion is a quiet statement. Taharqa was both the lion who defended Egypt and the man who ruled it. To truly understand this sculpture, you have to imagine the world in which it was created. The year is around 680 BCE. Egypt is a land of ancient temples, crumbling pyramids from centuries past, and a people deeply connected to their gods. But it is also a land facing challenges, powerful neighbors, shifting alliances, and internal divisions. Into this scene steps Taharqa, who ascends to the throne during a time when the Assyrian Empire in the east is expanding aggressively, swallowing up kingdoms one by one. His reign would become a balancing act, strengthening Egypt's defenses, preserving its traditions, and projecting the image of a united kingdom, even as threats loomed on the horizon. The Sphinx of Taharqa was more than art. It was propaganda in stone. In ancient Egypt, a sphinx was never just a statue, it was a guardian, a representation of royal authority, and often a physical embodiment of the pharaoh's role as protector of the realm. For Taharqa, the Sphinx also symbolized his legitimacy. As a Nubian ruling Egypt, he faced the challenge of convincing the Egyptian elite that he was the rightful heir to the throne. The sculpture's carefully balanced features, Egyptian in symbolism, Nubian in physical form, were a deliberate choice. It was saying, I am both. I belong to both worlds. The craftsmanship is remarkable considering the sculpture's small size. Made of granite, it would have been painstakingly shaped with tools harder than the stone itself. Craftsmen would have worked slowly, smoothing the lion's muscular body, carving the folds of the headdress, and carefully defining the face. Each stroke would have been a decision, each curve intentional. The end result is not just a likeness of a king, but an image meant to endure for thousands of years, preserving his legacy long after his kingdom fell. Yet, for all its strength, Taharqa's rule was not to last forever. The Assyrians eventually marched into Egypt, and despite his efforts, Taharqa was forced to retreat south to Nubia. Egypt would fall under foreign control once again. But here is the fascinating part. In Nubia, Taharqa remained a powerful ruler. His reign there continued, and his building projects flourished. He restored temples, sponsored art, and strengthened his homeland. In the end, his legacy was not defined by the loss of Egypt, but by the resilience of a king who adapted and endured. This is why the Sphinx of Taharqa matters. It is not just a relic of stone. It is a bridge between two great African civilizations, Egypt and Nubia, and a reminder that history is rarely as simple as one nation conquering another. Cultures mix, influence flows both ways, and identities are often more complex than the labels we give them. When visitors stand before the Sphinx today, many are surprised by its size. At just over 40 centimeters long, it is a fraction of the size they might expect. But that is part of its charm and its power. You have to lean in, to look closely, to truly appreciate it. And in doing so, you find yourself face to face with a king from nearly 2,700 years ago, his eyes carved to meet yours across millennia. The fact that the Sphinx of Taharqa has survived is remarkable in itself. Carried away from its original setting, it eventually found its way into the British Museum's collection. We don't know exactly where it stood in Taharqa's time, perhaps in a temple courtyard, perhaps on a ceremonial avenue, but we can be sure that it once sat in a place of honor, a silent sentinel watching over the rituals of a king who ruled from the heart of Africa to the sands of the Mediterranean. Even now, under museum lights, the Sphinx carries an aura of quiet authority. Its lion's body speaks of strength and protection. Its human face speaks of leadership and vision. And perhaps as you look at it, you can imagine the sound of the Nile flowing past the temples of Memphis, the heat shimmering over the desert sands, and the deep, steady voice of a king who saw himself as the guardian of two worlds. The Sphinx of Taharqa is a reminder that power is not only measured by territory or military victories. Sometimes it is measured by the ability to endure in memory, to remain present long after empires have vanished. Taharqa's kingdom may have changed, his cities may have crumbled, but his image, carved in stone, still commands attention. Statue of Ramesses II, the younger Memnon. In the still air of the British Museum's Egyptian Sculpture Gallery, a massive figure rests in silence. Its gaze does not meet yours directly, yet you feel its presence immediately. The sheer size alone is enough to make you pause, a single fragment of a statue, yet still towering over most visitors. This is the younger Memnon, the colossal head and torso of Pharaoh Ramesses II. The name is misleading, a holdover from a time when Western scholars misunderstood Egypt's past and named monuments according to Greek legends. But what we stand before is no myth. This is the stone memory of one of the most powerful rulers in ancient history. Ramesses II, known today as Ramesses the Great, reigned over Egypt for an astonishing 66 years, from 1279 to 1213 BCE. His reign marked the height of Egypt's power and influence, and he was celebrated for his military campaigns, vast building projects, and a personality that blended ambition, religious devotion, and a desire for immortality. Even in his lifetime, Ramesses crafted his own image as a god-king, commissioning temples, statues, and monuments in numbers never before seen. It is no wonder that his likeness, massive and idealized, was carved into blocks of stone so large that moving them across the desert would have been a feat in itself. The younger Memnon is made from a single block of red granite, quarried at Aswan, nearly 200 kilometers south of Luxor. Transporting such a colossal piece was an undertaking that required enormous manpower, precision, and engineering skill. This statue once stood in the Ramesseum, Ramesses II's mortuary temple in Thebes. The temple was built to honor him in life, and to secure his eternal memory in death. From the base to the top of the crown, the statue would have stood around 10 meters high. What we see today, the head and upper torso, weighs over 7 tons even after being broken from the rest. The name Younger Memnon comes from early European travelers and scholars who believed the statue depicted the legendary Greek hero Memnon, who was said to have fought in the Trojan War, and whose supposed statues were thought to sing at dawn in Thebes. When the fragment was brought to Britain in 1816, the nickname stuck. At the time, there was still much confusion about Egyptian history. Champollion had not yet fully deciphered hieroglyphs, and scholars often filtered Egypt through Greek and Roman myths. The journey from Egypt to London was itself an epic story. The massive granite piece was transported from the Ramesseum to the Nile by the Italian adventurer and strongman Giovanni Battista Belzoni. Belzoni was a showman, an engineer, and by modern standards, a looter. His team took 17 days just to move the statue from the temple to the river. They used wooden rollers, sledges, and sheer manpower, dragging it across rough terrain in the heat of the Egyptian sun. Then came the careful process of loading it onto a boat for the journey down the Nile to Alexandria, from where it was shipped to England. When it arrived in London, the younger Memnon became an instant sensation. Crowds came to marvel at it. Newspapers wrote of its incredible size, and artists sketched it. To Victorians, it was a tangible piece of an exotic, ancient world. But for Egyptians, it was a fragment of their heritage taken far from its homeland. Today, it remains at the British Museum, at the center of debates over cultural ownership and the ethics of removing antiquities. Standing before it, you cannot help but imagine its original setting. Picture the Ramesseum in its prime. Massive stone columns rising from a vast courtyard, walls covered in carved reliefs showing the pharaoh's victories, and colossal statues of Ramesses lined along the entrance. The granite statue would have been polished to a deep shine, the facial features crisp and idealized, the eyes gazing outward over the Nile Valley. Its scale was a deliberate statement, a reminder to every visitor, whether a humble farmer or a foreign envoy, of the absolute power of the ruler. Ramesses II was a master of self-promotion. He recorded his deeds in inscriptions that sometimes stretched the truth, turning military stalemates into grand victories. His most famous campaign, the Battle of Kadesh against the Hittites, was depicted on temple walls as a decisive triumph, even though modern historians believe it ended in a treaty rather than a clear win. This willingness to control the narrative extended to his monuments. Every colossal statue was part of a broader campaign to project an image of eternal dominance. But time is the ultimate equalizer. The Ramesseum, like many temples in Egypt, fell into ruin. Flooding, earthquakes, and centuries of neglect left its statues toppled and broken. The younger Memnon lay partly buried in sand for centuries before Belzoni arrived. Its survival is remarkable, but it is also incomplete, a reminder that even the greatest rulers could not control how the future would treat their legacies. In the museum's quiet, the statue takes on a different kind of power. Here, away from the desert sun, it becomes a meeting point between worlds, between ancient Egypt and modern London, between the ambitions of a pharaoh and the curiosity of today's visitors. You can stand inches away from the surface and see the fine chisel marks, the contours of the lips, the smooth planes of the cheeks. You can imagine the hands of ancient craftsmen working tirelessly to carve a ruler's likeness into unforgiving stone. There is a tension in this experience. On one hand, you feel awe at the artistry, the ambition, and the sheer human effort behind the statue. On the other, there is a quiet question: does it belong here? Should it one day return to the land where it was made, to stand once more under the same sky Ramesses himself knew? And so the younger Memnon remains, silent but not mute. It speaks through its scale, its craftsmanship, and its history. It tells a story not just of one man's reign, but of how human beings, across millennia, have sought to create, to remember, and to possess the past. The Minoan Bull Leaper. In the stillness of the Heraklion Archaeological Museum in Crete, there rests a small but mesmerizing object, a bronze figure, no larger than the span of a human hand, yet carrying the weight of an entire civilization's story. It is called the Minoan Bull Leaper, and though its size is modest, its presence is powerful. This delicate sculpture captures a frozen moment in midair, a human figure suspended above the back of a charging bull. The body arched, the arms outstretched, the movement perfectly balanced between grace and danger. It is not simply an artwork, it is a time capsule. It is the breath of a people who lived thousands of years ago, recorded in metal so that their daring, their rituals, and their view of the world could echo far beyond their own time. The Minoans were a seafaring civilization who thrived on the island of Crete between roughly 3000 and 1450 BCE. They built palaces not as fortresses, but as centers of trade, art, and ceremony. They painted their walls with scenes of dolphins gliding through blue waters, women in flowing dresses with flounced skirts, men with bare torsos in the sunlight. But among all their imagery, the bull stands out. It is everywhere. Painted, sculpted, carved into seals, even integrated into the architecture. To the Minoans, the bull was not just an animal, it was a symbol of vitality, power, and the connection between the human and the divine. The practice of bull leaping appears to have been one of the most spectacular and dangerous expressions of this symbolism. Unlike the later blood sports of Roman arenas, bull leaping was not about killing the animal. It was an acrobatic ritual in which participants would face a charging bull, grasp its horns or time their jump with its movement, and use its momentum to launch themselves into the air, flipping over its back before landing safely on the ground. This was no staged illusion. The bulls were real, powerful, and unpredictable. The humans were agile and brave, but also vulnerable. In that split second, life and death danced together in the arena. The bronze bull leaper statue, dated to around 1600–140–50 BCE, is remarkable not only for what it depicts but for how it was made. It is cast from a single piece of bronze using the lost wax casting method, a sophisticated technique for its time. The sculptor shaped the figure with a keen eye for anatomy, the taut muscles of the arms and legs, the curvature of the spine, the balance between the human body and the animal form. The bull itself is compact, yet full of energy, the head lowered, the forelegs bent in a powerful push forward. The leaper's body stretches in a smooth arc above it, frozen in the instant between takeoff and landing. And yet, what makes this sculpture truly compelling is not just its technical perfection, but the question of why this ritual existed at all. Was bull leaping a religious offering to the gods, a symbolic reenactment of myth, or a rite of passage into adulthood? Some scholars believe it had connections to the Minoan worship of a bull-headed deity, a possible origin of the later Greek myth of the Minotaur, the creature trapped in the labyrinth. Others think it may have been linked to fertility rituals, the bull representing male strength, and the leap symbolizing renewal or triumph over chaos. Whatever the truth, The fact that such an event inspired this kind of artistry suggests that it was not a marginal practice, it was central to the Minoan identity. The survival of the bull leaper is itself a small miracle. The Minoan civilization fell into decline after around 1450 BCE, possibly due to a combination of natural disasters and foreign invasions. Volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, and tidal waves disrupted life on Crete. The palaces, including the famous Knossos, were eventually abandoned or destroyed. In the centuries that followed, Minoan traditions merged with, or were replaced by Mycenaean culture, and later by the Greek city-states. Much of the Minoan world was lost to time, but this small bronze leaper endured. Buried and protected for centuries, it re-emerged in the modern era, carrying with it a message from a vanished people. When you stand before it today, you can almost feel the tension in that leap. The momentary weightlessness, the risk, the exhilaration. The sculpture is silent, but in your mind's ear, you can hear the muffled thud of hooves against packed earth, the rush of air past your face, the collective intake of breath from the watching crowd. You can imagine the sun overhead, the scent of dust and sweat, the sharp glare in the bull's eyes. You can sense the discipline it took to train for such an event, the courage to face such a creature, and the pride in succeeding. Yet there is another layer to this object, one that speaks to all of human history. The Minoan bull leaper is not just about athletic skill or religious devotion. It is about the human urge to transform fleeting moments into something permanent. The actual leap lasts only a second. The applause, the relief, the adrenaline, all fade quickly, but in casting it in bronze, the Minoans captured that instant forever. And now, thousands of years later, we are still here, looking at it, thinking about it, letting our imaginations take that same leap. There is also the question of its realism. Did the Minoan bull leapers truly leap entirely over the bull's back, as shown in the art? Or were the scenes symbolic exaggerations, an idealized vision of what the ritual represented, rather than a literal depiction? Some modern experiments with bulls suggest that such a leap could be possible, but extremely dangerous and rare. Perhaps the ritual combined athletic skill with stylized movements, each performance a blend of reality and performance art. For the Minoans, the line between sport, ceremony, and theater was thin, if it even existed at all. The bull leaper also reminds us that history is not always told by the biggest monuments or the loudest victories. Sometimes it is the small things, a single statue, a single gesture, that hold the deepest truths. In its modest size, it invites you to look closer, to lean in, to notice the tiny details that speak volumes. The delicate curve of the leaper's fingers, the subtle asymmetry of the bull's horns, the way the human and animal seem to move together in a shared rhythm rather than in opposition. The Minoan bull leaper is not just a work of art, it is a bridge, across time, across culture, across the gap between the living and the dead. It asks us to remember that life, no matter the era, is made of moments that are brief, dangerous, beautiful, and worth preserving. And so, as we leave the quiet halls of the museum, we carry with us the image of that leap, suspended in the air, forever defying gravity, forever daring the impossible. Somewhere in the deep corridors of our shared human memory, the Minoan bull leaper is still in motion. Rind mathematical papyrus. In the quiet deserts of Egypt, where wind moves softly across endless sands, there lies a record, not carved into stone, not etched into towering monuments, but written in careful ink on a strip of ancient papyrus. It is known as the Rind mathematical papyrus, a humble-looking scroll that holds within it the thoughts of a mind from more than 3,600 years ago. This is not a royal decree, it is not a hymn to a god, it is in essence a notebook, and yet it is one of the most remarkable pieces of evidence we have about how the ancient Egyptians understood the world through numbers. It was discovered in the mid-19th century, far from the bustling cities of our own time. The papyrus was bought in 1858 by a Scottish antiquarian named Alexander Henry Rind, who had been traveling in Egypt. Rind was not in the best of health, but he had a deep interest in the ancient past. He found the papyrus in Luxor among a small collection of antiquities. It looked fragile, brittle with age, but the ink was still legible. In his hands, Rind realized he had stumbled upon something far more than a curiosity. It was a direct window into the intellectual life of Egypt in the Second Intermediate Period, around 1550 BCE. Today it is held in the British Museum, carefully preserved behind glass, unrolled enough for us to see its neatly written columns of hieratic script. The papyrus is just over half a meter long, with a second fragment held in New York, at the Brooklyn Museum. What makes it so special is not just its age, but its purpose. It is essentially a mathematical textbook, a series of problems and solutions designed to teach the reader how to calculate everything from the division of bread and beer to the area of fields and the volume of granaries. When you look at the rind mathematical papyrus, you are looking at the work of a scribe named Ahmes. He even signed his name in the text, an unusual act of authorship in a time when many scribes remained anonymous. Ahmes tells us that he is copying the work from an even older document, one that may have been written a century or more before his own time. In other words, this scroll is a copy of a copy, an ancient mind preserving the knowledge of an even more ancient mind. The problems written in the papyrus begin in a surprisingly friendly way. They are practical, grounded in the needs of a society that thrived along the Nile. Egypt was a land of farmers, builders, and traders. To build a wall, to divide a harvest, to calculate how much grain could fit into a storage bin, these were not abstract puzzles, they were the everyday mathematics of survival. One example is a problem that asks the reader to divide 10 loaves of bread equally among 10 men, but not in whole loaves. Each man must get a fair portion, and the scribe walks you through the process step by step. Another problem calculates the area of a circular field. The Egyptians didn't have pi as we know it, but they had a formula that gave them a reasonably close approximation. Their approach was rooted in geometry and proportions, using repeated doubling and halving as the basis for multiplication and division. Perhaps the most famous section of the papyrus is a sequence of problems involving the so-called seket, the ratio that described the slope of a pyramid. By using these calculations, Egyptian architects could ensure that massive stone monuments were built with perfect angles, rising toward the sky with symmetrical precision. This means the Rind Papyrus is, in a way, a record of how the Great Pyramids might have been measured and planned. What's fascinating is that the papyrus doesn't just present problems, it presents them in a didactic, almost conversational tone. Ahmes often states the problem, then demonstrates the solution, showing the steps clearly. It's almost like listening to a teacher guiding a student through an exercise. Do this first, then this, and here is your answer. In this way, it bridges an incredible gap of time. You can imagine a young scribe, 3,600 years ago, hunched over his own piece of papyrus, following Ahmes's neat instructions. And here's where the sleepy pacing sets in. Because when you think about it, mathematics in ancient Egypt was slow. There were no calculators, no quick shortcuts. Everything was done by hand, with deliberate care. A single problem could take minutes, even hours, to work through. Numbers were represented in hieratic script, with different symbols for 1, 10, 100, and so on. Multiplication was not just times tables but a method of doubling numbers, step by step. Division was often solved by finding a sequence of fractions that, when added together, produced the correct total. This method, called the Egyptian fraction system, is one of the most distinctive features of their mathematics. The Rind Papyrus gives us a rare chance to see this system in action. Instead of writing 2-3, the Egyptians would write 1-2 plus 1-6. Instead of 3-4, they might write 1-2 plus 1-4. At first glance, it seems unnecessarily complicated, but it was a deeply logical method within their cultural and mathematical framework. Each problem in the papyrus is like a small puzzle that reveals not only the answer but also the process. Beyond practical problems, the Rind Papyrus also touches on abstract puzzles, mathematical riddles in a way. There are problems involving the summation of series, geometric progressions, and even what we might call algebraic thinking. These examples suggest that Egyptian mathematics was not simply a tool for daily life, but also a field of study in its own right, something to be explored and mastered. Holding the papyrus, if you could, would be like holding a whisper from the past. The fibers are fragile, brown with age. The ink, though faded, still carries the neat, deliberate strokes of Ahmes's reed pen. And in those strokes lies a continuity of human thought. A man who lived thousands of years ago, patiently explaining to his students how to share bread, how to measure land, how to calculate the angle of a pyramid wall. What's perhaps most remarkable is how familiar it feels. Even though the symbols are different, the logic is something we can follow today. You can take the problems in the Rind Papyrus and solve them with modern notation, and the answers will match. It's a reminder that while the tools of mathematics have evolved, the mind that seeks to understand the world through numbers has always been with us. In this way, the Rind Papyrus is not just a relic, it's a bridge. It links us to the working scribes of ancient Thebes, to the farmers who measured their fields, to the builders who laid the foundations of temples, and to the unknown author whose work Ahmes preserved. It tells us that curiosity, precision, and the need to teach and share knowledge are as old as civilization itself. Tonight, as we imagine this ancient scroll in the quiet halls of the museum, we can let our thoughts drift back to that timeless image, a scribe seated in the warm light of an oil lamp, papyrus stretched before him, pen in hand, slowly working through a problem, not because he must rush, but because every line, every fraction, every calculation is part of a larger conversation that began thousands of years ago and has never truly ended. Egyptian clay model of cattle. In the still, arid silence of ancient Egypt, life was shaped not just by the Nile's waters, but by the rhythm of work. the cycles of seasons, and the animals that made survival possible. Among the treasures left behind by this great civilization are objects so ordinary in appearance that they might seem unremarkable, yet they hold profound meaning. One such piece is a humble but intricate clay model of cattle, carefully shaped by hands that lived thousands of years ago. This artifact is more than a miniature representation of livestock. It is a preserved echo of Egypt's relationship with its most vital source of agricultural power. The clay model was found within a tomb, a place where the ancient Egyptians prepared their dead for an eternal existence. In their belief system, life after death mirrored life on earth. To sustain the soul in the afterlife, everything that was necessary in the world of the living was replicated, either in physical form, through actual goods, or symbolically, through models. The cattle model, therefore, was not just art, it was a promise of abundance, ensuring the deceased would have herds to provide milk, meat, hides, and labor forever. Cattle in ancient Egypt were far more than mere beasts of burden. They were indicators of wealth, status, and prosperity. To own many cattle was to command respect, for these animals were central to farming, plowing, and transportation. They were also deeply tied to religious symbolism. Hathor, the goddess of motherhood, joy, and music, was often depicted as a cow, or with cow-like horns. This divine connection imbued cattle with sacred value, making their presence in funerary art both practical and spiritual. The craftsmanship of the model itself speaks to the care invested in its creation. Each animal is shaped with distinct features, a rounded body suggesting strength, a carefully formed head with tiny impressions marking the eyes, and curved horns that reflect the breed common in the Nile Valley during the Middle Kingdom period. The surface bears traces of pigment, indicating that it was once painted, likely in the natural colors of cattle from reddish-brown to mottled white and black. Though small in size, the detail is intentional, showing the artisan's understanding of both anatomy and the symbolic role these animals played. To picture the context of this artifact, we must imagine the Nile Valley thousands of years ago. The river's flooding would deposit rich silt on the fields, making them fertile for crops like wheat and barley. The cattle would plow these fields in the cooler mornings, their hooves pressing into the moist earth, their breath steaming in the air as the sun rose over the horizon. In the evenings, herds would be led back to enclosures near the villages, their lowing sounds blending with the chatter of farmers and the crackle of cooking fires. This cycle of agricultural life was so central to survival that it became a theme in both daily art and funerary goods. Archaeological discoveries of similar models show that they often came in groups. Sometimes they were placed alongside miniature figures of herdsmen, each frozen in the act of tending the cattle, guiding them, feeding them, or milking them. These scenes were like snapshots of everyday rural life, designed to serve the deceased forever. They remind us that while the pyramids and temples draw the most attention, much of ancient Egypt's power rested in its ability to sustain itself through farming and livestock. The particular clay model we speak of today is thought to date back over 4,000 years. Its survival is nothing short of remarkable. Clay, though durable when baked, is fragile when handled carelessly. That this model endured centuries in the dry tomb environment is a testament to both the preservation of Egypt's desert climate and the skill of those who made it. The piece offers insight into the values of a society that understood the importance of representing not only kings and gods, but also the humble, hard-working animals that kept the kingdom alive. Cattle also played a role in rituals and offerings. Certain festivals involved the sacrifice of cattle, their meat distributed as part of communal feasts. The hide might be used for leather, while the horns could be shaped into tools or ceremonial objects. The Egyptians recorded their herds meticulously, and scenes of cattle counting appear in tomb paintings, further underscoring the importance of livestock management. The inclusion of such a model in a tomb reflects the idea that the afterlife required preparation. Just as the Nile's floods were predictable yet essential, the provision of goods for the soul's journey was a matter of certainty and care. The cattle model symbolized nourishment, labor, and the unbroken cycle of life, a reassurance to the deceased that their needs would be met in perpetuity. When we look at the clay today, it may be cracked in places, its paint faded, its edges worn. Yet in its silence, it speaks volumes. It tells us that ancient Egypt was not only a land of pharaohs and monumental architecture, but also a land where farmers, herders, and artisans worked together to build a society capable of sustaining life in one of the most challenging environments on Earth. For the modern observer, there is a quiet intimacy in such an object. We are not confronted with grandeur or overwhelming scale. Instead, we are drawn into a small, tangible piece of daily life, a reminder that history is not just written in gold and stone, but in the humble clay that someone shaped with care, hoping to give life beyond death. And in that small act, thousands of years ago, they have succeeded. Their cattle still stand, their story still told, their presence still felt. As we leave the tomb in our minds, stepping back into the sunlight, We can almost hear the sound of hooves on packed earth, the call of a herdsman across the fields, and the rustle of papyrus leaves in the Nile breeze. The clay model remains where it has rested for millennia, a quiet guardian of a truth that has outlived dynasties. Survival is not only about kings and battles, but about the animals and people whose work sustains all. Throne of Weapons. There are certain artifacts in the world that do not simply tell a story, they hold a silence that makes you stop and think. They do not just sit in glass cases to be admired. They demand that you lean closer, that you look beyond the surface, that you ask questions you might not be ready to answer. One such object is the Throne of Weapons, housed in the British Museum. At first glance you might think it is some kind of modern sculpture, perhaps a bold artistic statement made from metal and shaped into the form of a chair. But this throne is not ordinary. It is a seat of authority, forged not from gold, not from stone, but from the remains of tools meant for destruction, actual weapons. This throne was created in the early 2000s, in Mozambique, a country in southeastern Africa that had endured a long and devastating civil war. The war had lasted from 1977 to 1992, leaving deep scars on the land and in the memories of its people. When the fighting ended, the nation was left with something that was both symbolic and dangerously real. Thousands upon thousands of weapons scattered across the country. AK-47s, rifles, pistols, rocket launchers, rusting, abandoned or hidden away in the countryside. These were instruments of fear and death, and yet they had to be dealt with. The Throne of Weapons was born from a remarkable idea. Instead of simply melting down the guns, an organization called Transforming Arms into Tools, or TAE, collected these weapons and handed them to artists. The goal was simple but powerful: turn instruments of war into works of art that could speak of peace. The artist who made the Throne of Weapons was Cristóvão Estevão Canhavato, known as Kester. He took real weapons that had once been held in the hands of soldiers, metal that had seen battles, perhaps taken lives, and transformed them into a single object, a chair. But this was not a chair meant for comfort. It was a chair that makes you think about the cost of power. If you were to stand in front of it today, you would see the dark, weathered metal of dismantled rifles forming the legs, the seat, the backrest. Every piece is recognizable if you know the shapes of guns. The barrel of an AK-47 might be part of the armrest. The curved magazine could be welded into the base. The skeletal frames of once deadly machines now frozen into a single, unmoving form. And yet, even as you look at it, the thought crosses your mind. This chair is strong. These weapons were built to last, to withstand years in harsh environments. Now they have been repurposed to carry the weight of a person, though no one would dare sit upon it without feeling the strange presence of what it's made from. The British Museum acquired this throne in 2001, not as a trophy, but as a story. It is displayed in the museum's Africa galleries, where visitors pause before it, read its description, and try to imagine what it must have been like to live in a place where these weapons were part of everyday life. For many, the Throne of Weapons is not beautiful in the traditional sense. It is heavy with meaning. It forces you to face the idea that objects hold history, not only the history we want to celebrate, but also the parts we would rather forget. When you think about it, a throne is usually a symbol of leadership, control, and often luxury. Kings, emperors, and rulers throughout history have had thrones made from the most valuable materials: ivory, gold, rare woods. This throne, however, carries an entirely different kind of symbolism. It is a reminder that power often comes through violence, but it can also be reshaped. It asks you, what happens when the tools of war are stripped of their purpose and given a new life? Does their past vanish, or does it remain forever in the metal, in the cold touch of the steel? Kester's work is part of a larger movement in Mozambique. After the war, the Transforming Arms into Tools project encouraged communities to trade in weapons in exchange for useful items, sewing machines, bicycles, farming equipment. These exchanges helped remove thousands of guns from circulation. But beyond the practical, there was also a deep symbolic act taking place. Each weapon destroyed and turned into art became a testament to resilience. It was a way of saying, this will no longer harm anyone. The Throne of Weapons also tells us something about memory. A weapon, once used, is not simply a lump of metal, it becomes a carrier of stories. We may not know whose hands once gripped the guns in this throne. We don't know where they were used, or on which days they were fired. We don't know if they brought fear to villages, or if they were hidden away and never fired at all. But we do know they were collected after the war, taken apart, and welded into this seat. In that transformation, there is a shift from destruction to creation. And yet the viewer cannot ignore the fact that these were once weapons. That is the weight of the piece. In the quiet halls of the museum, people sometimes stand for long minutes in front of the throne. Some take photos. Others lean in to study the individual parts, pointing out the shapes of gun barrels and triggers. There is often a silence, an unspoken recognition that while this is art, it is also a graveyard of sorts. A graveyard not for people, but for the tools that once held the power to end lives. From a wider perspective, the throne of weapons fits into a long history of objects being repurposed after conflict. In ancient times, swords might be reforged into farming tools. Bronze from cannons could be melted down to make statues. Even in more recent history, parts of warplanes have been turned into civilian goods. But there is something especially direct about this throne. It doesn't hide what it is. You can see every part of the weapons. The transformation is in the arrangement, not in disguise. The message is clear. Violence can be dismantled, but we must still face its remains. The throne doesn't let you look away. It forces you to think about how wars shape the physical world around us, and how art can become a tool for healing and remembering at the same time. Perhaps the most powerful thing about the throne of weapons is that it is not about forgetting. It does not erase the past. Instead, it holds it in place and asks you to sit with it, not literally, but in your thoughts. It shows that the past can be reimagined without being erased, and maybe in some way it asks us to imagine a future where the weapons we build today might one day be nothing more than cold metal shapes in a museum, stripped of their power, serving as warnings rather than threats. In this way, the throne of weapons stands quietly in the British Museum, not as a celebration, but as a reminder. A reminder that even the darkest tools can be transformed, that the memory of violence can be turned into a conversation about peace, and that sometimes the most powerful seats are not the ones occupied by rulers, but the ones that remain empty, asking you to think about the kind of power you wish to see in the world.